He built an empire with blood and iron, then destroyed it with 3 words spoken in front of 1,000 witnesses. That's where this story begins, not at the throne, not at the battlefield, but at the exact moment a king who feared nothing finally met the one thing that could unmake him, the silence of a woman he broke. Stay with me until the end. This one hits different. If you're watching from your city tonight, drop it in the comments. Like this video, and let's begin. The morning Darius Thornheart made the worst decision of his life, the sky above Ravaran was the color of old bone, not gray, not white. That particular shade of pale that belongs to things already dead but not yet aware of it. Bleached and empty and faintly wrong in the way a soldier's face goes wrong in the seconds after a mortal wound, before the body is caught up with the fact of its own ending. The sun was up there somewhere behind that sky, but it gave no warmth. It gave no light worth speaking of. It gave nothing, the way kings learn to give nothing, because giving is a form of exposure, and exposure is how empires fall. Darius stood at the window of the war chamber on the eastern wing of the Thornheart fortress, a room that smelled permanently of iron shavings and old sweat and the particular animal musk of men who had spent decades being afraid of the man who summoned them here. And he stared at his kingdom spread below him like something he had personally arranged, stone by stone, body by body, through 15 years of absolute will. Ravaran, 50,000 warriors garrisoned across 11 provinces, tribute flowing in from 14 subjugated territories, trade routes controlled from the northern ice passes down to the coastal salt flats, an economy built on the simple logic that when you are strong enough, other people's resources become your resources. And when you are feared enough, that arrangement remains stable indefinitely. He had built this with his hands, with his father's legacy as the starting point and his own ambition as the fuel. He had earned every stone of it through pain and precision and a willingness to make choices that other men flinched away from. He was 34 years old. He had never once in his life questioned whether any of it was worth what it cost him. He was questioning it now. Behind him, the war chamber held 11 men. His senior generals, his council, the inner ring of power that kept Ravaran functioning, that kept the tribute flowing and the garrisons loyal and the borders unbroken. Men he had trusted, men who had stood beside him in campaigns that would have broken lesser commanders, men who were looking at him right now with an expression he had never seen directed at him before in all his years of rule. Doubt. The situation is simple, said General Varen Holt, Darius's oldest field commander, a man with a jaw like a ship's prow and scars that told the story of 20 years of northern campaigns. Holt placed both hands flat on the war table and leaned forward in the way he always did when he was about to say something he had already decided could not be argued with. The Keldrath coalition watches every move you make, every decision. They are not looking for military weakness, my king. They are looking for personal weakness, and right now they have found something to point at. Darius did not turn from the window. Say what you mean. You know what I mean. Say it out loud, Holt. In front of everyone, say exactly what you mean. A pause. The kind of pause that has weight in it, that has the accumulated pressure of 11 men's opinions pressing against one man's reluctance to be the one who voices them. Holt straightened. His voice came out flat and deliberate, the way he delivered orders before a charge. The Omega, Elyra, the mute girl you have allowed into your personal quarters, into your war councils, into spaces that no Omega in the history of this kingdom has ever occupied. The Keldrath spies have reported this to their lords. Our own nobles have begun to whisper that your judgment has been compromised. The word compromise landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Darius felt the impact of it in his spine. He turned from the window. Every man in the room saw his face change. It was not the change of a man surprised or wounded. It was the change of a man who had already been having this exact argument with himself in the private hours before dawn, who had already run every version of every outcome through the cold machinery of his strategic mind, and who had arrived at the war chamber this morning carrying the weight of a conclusion he had not yet found a way to stop himself from reaching. You are telling me, he said quietly, that my personal affairs have become a strategic liability. I am telling you, Holt said, holding his gaze without flinching, because Holt was the only man in the room who could look Darius Thornheart in the eyes without calculation running across his face. that the Keldrath lords have begun calling you the Mute King, that they say a man who keeps a speechless Omega as a companion has lost his appetite for conquest and replaced it with something soft and sentimental. They are using it, Darius. They are building their rebellion on the image of a weakened king. Boisiges some silence. The particular silence of 11 men waiting for a decision that they all privately believed had already been made. "Leave me," Darius said. They filed out without argument. Holt was the last to go. At the door, the old general paused but did not turn back. His voice was lower now, stripped of the formal register, carrying something that in another man might have been called grief. "She has been good for you. I am not blind to it. But what is good for a man is not always what is good for a king, and you are first a king." He left. The door closed. Darius stood alone in the war chamber and let the silence come all the way in. The thing about Elyra was this: she had never asked for anything. Not a title, not recognition, not a place at the council table, or an elevation in status, or the formal acknowledgement that their relationship had become something the court had no appropriate category for. She had never reached for power. She had never leveraged proximity. She had never, in the 8 months she had existed inside the walls of this fortress, done a single thing that could be characterized as ambition. She had simply been present. It was the most disarming thing Darius had ever encountered in his life, and he had encountered armies. He had found her 11 months ago in the aftermath of the Aldenmere campaign, a punitive expedition against a border settlement that had withheld tribute for 2 consecutive seasons. The campaign itself had been routine, decisive, the kind of operation that Reverend conducted periodically to remind its subordinate territories that calculation was not the same as safety. The settlement had been reduced, its leadership replaced, the tribute adjusted upward as a penalty. On the last day of the operation, moving through what remained of Aldenmere's outer district, Darius had found her sitting in the courtyard of a collapsed merchant's house, surrounded by rubble and ash, and the particular stillness that falls over places after violence has finished with them. She was not hiding. She was not fleeing. She was sitting with her back against a broken wall and her hands folded in her lap, watching the soldiers move through the district with the expression of someone who had already seen everything that was going to happen and had simply decided to remain present for it. She was perhaps 20 years old, perhaps younger. It was difficult to say. Her eyes were silver, not the light gray that people sometimes described as silver, but actually silver, with a depth to them that made looking directly into them feel like looking into water that was deeper than it appeared. She was thin in the way of someone who had been surviving rather than living. Her clothes were the muted, rough-spun work of a woman with no resources and no patron. His lieutenant, Sarath, had gestured toward her with the casual dismissiveness that soldiers develop toward people who have no military relevance. Omega. No papers, no documented bloodline. Probably a refugee from the inland settlements. "Can she speak?" Darius had asked. Sarath had shrugged. "We tried. Nothing. Could be mute from birth. Could be shock. Either way, not our concern." Darius had stood in that rubble-strewn courtyard and looked at the silver-eyed woman for a long moment. There was no strategic logic to what he did next, no calculation, no advantage. Something he could not name and would not have admitted to if pressed, had simply made the decision before his rational mind could intervene. "Bring her," he had said. "She comes with us." Sarath had stared at him. "My king." Did I stutter, Lieutenant? She had come with them. And in the 11 months since then, what had happened inside the Thornheart fortress was not something Darius had ever found adequate words for, which was ironic given that the woman at the center of it used no words at all. She communicated in the grammar of bodies, a tilt of the head, the precise angle of her hands, the quality of her attention when he spoke, full, complete, unguarded in a way that no person who understood power had ever aimed at him before. Because people who understood power were always calculating the cost of whatever they revealed. Elyra revealed everything. She had apparently decided at some point before he met her that she had nothing left to hide. She sat with him through the nights when his mind would not stop moving through the strategic problems of the kingdom, the tribute disputes, the border pressures, the internal factional tensions that required constant management. She did not offer solutions. She offered company. She had a way of placing herself in his peripheral vision that somehow quieted the machinery of his thinking without shutting it down, The way a hand placed on a vibrating surface doesn't stop the motion but changes its character. She tended his wounds after training sessions and campaigns with a focused, practical care that contained no sentiment and no performance. She pressed herbs into cuts with the exactness of someone who had learned field medicine out of necessity rather than education. When he flinched, which he did rarely, but sometimes, she did not acknowledge it in a way that would require him to react to her acknowledgement. She simply continued. She sat through war councils without a word, and without the blank expression of someone who understood nothing. Her eyes tracked the tactical maps. Her attention moved in ways that told him she was following the logic of every argument. Once, during a particularly heated debate about the Keldrath border, he had looked at her face in the moment a certain proposal was made and seen something flicker across those silver eyes. A quick assessment, a calculation, a conclusion drawn so fast it barely registered as expression. And he had found himself adjusting his own position based on nothing more than the angle of her reaction. He had never told anyone that. But the truth was the truth. This woman who could not speak had become the clearest voice in his life. And now his generals were telling him she was a liability. And somewhere beneath the cold strategic architecture of his thinking, beneath the disciplined removal of sentiment that 15 years on a war throne had trained into him, Darius Thornheart was discovering that the thing he had built to protect himself, the absolute certainty that power was the only real thing, that vulnerability was the seed of destruction, was not as solid as he had believed. The fracture line had a name. It was silver-eyed. It never spoke. And he was terrified of what it meant that it mattered to him as much as it did. He found her in the upper garden, which was not a garden in any lush or decorative sense, but a stone terrace on the fortress's southern face where a previous Thornheart had installed raised beds of hardy northern plants, gray-leafed herbs, low drought-resistant shrubs, things built for survival in a climate that was not particularly interested in beauty. Elyra came here in the mornings when the light was right. Darius had never asked why. Some things in his life he had simply allowed to remain as they were, without examination. She was crouched beside one of the raised beds when he arrived, her fingers moving through the gray-green herbs with the unhurried attention she brought to everything. She heard him approach. She always heard everything. Her senses were preternatural in their sharpness, as if the absence of speech had been redistributed into an excess of everything else. And she did not startle or rise. She simply turned her head and looked at him. The silver eyes did what they always did. They read him completely. He watched her read him, watched the small, precise movements of her expression as she processed what she saw in his posture, his face, the particular way he was holding his shoulders this morning, that told the story of a decision that had already been made before he arrived here. Her hands stilled in the herbs. Her chin dropped fractionally. Her eyes stayed on him, steady and unflinching and full of that devastating completeness that had never once, in 11 months, wavered. She knew. She already knew. "Elyra," he said. She stood, unhurried. She wiped her hands on the rough cloth of her outer wrap and turned to face him fully, feet planted, shoulders square, posture carrying none of the submission that Omegas in Ravaran were taught to perform in the presence of rank. She had never performed submission. It was one of the 1,000 things about her that he had never been able to categorize properly. He had prepared words. He had been composing them since before dawn, in the war chamber, in the corridors on the walk here, arranging them into the most direct and least destructive configuration he could manage. He had told himself this was a tactical matter, a necessary adjustment, the kind of hard decision that leadership required. The words he had prepared fell apart entirely when he looked at her face. He started over. "The council met this morning," he said. Holt delivered their assessment of the political situation with the Keldrath coalition. He stopped. Started again. "The conclusion they reached, that I concur with, is that the current arrangement is creating a vulnerability that my enemies are actively exploiting." She watched him. Said nothing. Could say nothing. "You understand what I'm saying?" She understood exactly what he was saying. The silver eyes told him so. The very steadiness of her standing there in the morning light with the gray herbs at her back and the bone-colored sky above them told him she had understood this moment was coming before he had. "I cannot have what Reverend requires of me and also have—" He stopped. The word that needed to come next would not come. He forced past it. "The nobility is using your presence here as evidence that my judgment has softened. The Keldrath lords are using it to recruit for their coalition. Every day you remain in this fortress in the current capacity, I am handing my enemies a weapon." A breath moved through her, slow, deliberate. Her jaw worked once, briefly, as if she were attempting something with her throat that her body had never learned to complete. "I need you to leave the fortress," Darius said. "I will arrange a settlement, resources, a location, protection. You will lack nothing material." The silver eyes flinched. Just once. The smallest possible movement. A contraction, like light moving across the surface of deep water, gone almost before it registered. "I'm sorry," he said. And then, because the strategy required it, because Holt's voice was still in his head explaining the necessity with the blunt efficiency of a man who had planned too many campaigns to be moved by sentiment, he said the thing he had been avoiding, the thing that would close the door cleanly and finally, and without any ambiguity that could later be exploited. "What we had was a mistake. You should not have been brought here. You are not what this throne requires." The words landed in the space between them. He watched them land. He did not know what he had expected. Tears, perhaps. A collapse of the composure she always carried. Some visible breaking that would confirm the necessity of this, that would tell him she was exactly what Holt feared, a softness at the core of a king's chest where there should be iron. What he got instead was worse. She did not cry. She did not flinch again. She looked at him with the silver eyes for a long moment, 5 seconds, 10, an eternity. And in those eyes he saw something move through them that he had never seen there before. Not grief, not anger. Something older and quieter than either of those. Something that had been waiting in a deep and patient place for a long time, and had just received the specific signal it had been waiting for. Then she closed her eyes. And when they opened again, they were not quite the same eyes. They were silver still, but the depth in them was different. The depth in them was much greater. The way a lake seems shallow in summer sunlight and then on a cloudy day reveals that it has no visible bottom. She turned from him and walked away without urgency. She did not look back. Darius stood in the stone garden with the herb smell on the cold air and watched her go and felt, in the place behind his sternum where he kept everything he refused to acknowledge, something happened that he had no framework for. He pushed it down. He returned to the war chamber. He spent the afternoon in tactical meetings. The public rejection came 3 days later. Holt had argued for a formal proceeding. Something visible, something the court and the nobility and the diplomatic observers from the neighboring territories could witness and report on. Proof of decisive action, proof that the king had identified the vulnerability and excised it with the efficiency he applied to all strategic problems. Darius had agreed. The great hall of the Thornheart fortress held perhaps 400 people on formal occasions. Nobility, senior officers, court functionaries, the various diplomatic attachés from territories that maintained a permanent presence in Roveran's capital. On the morning of the proceeding, it held close to that number. Word had moved through the fortress in the preceding days the way important news always moved in enclosed systems of power, fast, imprecise, amplified by anticipation. They had all come to see what the king was going to do. The hall was built from dark Roveran stone, the local basalt that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, that made spaces feel permanent and weighty and slightly threatening in ways that were useful for a kingdom built on the logic of superior force. Torches bracketed the walls every 10 feet, their light warm and wavering against the cold solidity of the stone. The smell was wax and old smoke and the animal warmth of too many bodies in an enclosed space. Darius stood at the front of the hall in the formal position, not the throne itself, but the command dais 3 steps below it, which was the position that conveyed authority without the ceremonial distance of the full throne height. He was in formal armor, the Thornheart black with the silver wolf emblem at the chest. His face was the face he wore to war councils and treaty negotiations and executions, empty of anything personal, organized entirely around function. Elyra was brought in from the eastern door. She walked under her own power. She had not been restrained or compelled. Whatever Sarath and the 2 senior guards accompanying her had said to bring her here, Darius did not know the specifics, and he had not asked. She walked through the full hall of 400 witnesses with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides, and those silver eyes moving neither left nor right, fixed on some middle distance that was not his face and not the floor, and not any of the assembled court. She stopped 20 feet from the dais. The hall was completely silent. Darius looked at her. She looked at the middle distance. He had prepared this too. The formal language, the specific phrasing that would accomplish what Holt had described as necessary, a clean, unambiguous, public severing of all association, delivered in terms that his enemy's spies would carry back to the Keldrath coalition with nothing ambiguous to work with. He delivered it, by formal declaration before the court and council of Ravarin, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the stone hall with the trained projection of a man who had given field commands in the roar of battle. I am severing all association between the Thornheart seat and the individual known as Elyra of no house and no bloodline. She came to this court through an error of judgment that I am correcting now. Her presence here served no purpose this kingdom required. She leaves this hall with a settlement sufficient to remove any claim on this house's resources, and she does not return. He paused. The silence pressed. She was a mistake, he said. A weakness I permitted. It will not happen again. He had delivered harder sentences in his life. He had ordered punitive campaigns. He had sentenced men to death. He had looked into the eyes of people he was destroying and held his face steady and his voice level because that was what power demanded, and he had always been willing to pay what power demanded. This was harder than any of those. He did not understand why. He refused to examine it. Elyra stood in the center of the hall for a breath, for two. The silver eyes had come forward from their middle-distance focus at some point during the formal declaration. He could not have said exactly when, and they were looking at him now, directly, with that same still completeness they always brought to looking at him, that quality of seeing everything without flinching from any of it. Then she closed her eyes for the second time, and when she opened them, the silver was different again. Not the lake without a bottom. Something else. Something Darius had no category for in the taxonomy of human expression he had spent 15 years studying and learning to read. Something that lived on the other side of grief, past it, through it, arrived somewhere beyond it into a territory that had no name in any language he knew. She reached up and pressed her right hand flat over her chest, over her heart. She held it there for 3 seconds. Then she lowered her hand and walked out of the hall. The court had expected. He realized this in the strange, too clear perception of a man in the middle of a moment he will spend the rest of his life reconstructing. They had expected some display. Tears, or a plea, or the particular dignified silence of someone performing bravery. They had expected something human in their register. What they got was something else, something that moved through the room after she left. The way a temperature change moves through a space, not dramatic, not visible, but undeniable. A change in the quality of the air, a sense that something had just occurred in this hall that had nothing to do with the formal procedure they had witnessed, and that they did not have the language or the frame of reference to describe. 397 people stood in the Thornheart Great Hall after Elyra walked out of it. Not one of them spoke. The silence lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then Holt, practical and tactical as always, moved forward to address the dispersal of the court, and the moment broke, and people began to move, and voices returned, and the machinery of the day reasserted itself. Darius stood on the command dais. He felt nothing. That was what he told himself. He felt nothing, because this was a strategic decision, correctly made, and feeling was not a relevant variable. He stood on the dais and felt absolutely nothing, and the absence of feeling was the loudest thing in the room. That night, the first river north of the capital ran black for an hour before dawn. The garrison stationed along its banks reported it the following morning with the confused pragmatism of soldiers confronted by something they lacked vocabulary for. The water had changed color, black as old ink, for perhaps 40 minutes, and then it had returned to normal, and nothing was wrong with the fish, and nothing was wrong with the banks, and nothing was visibly wrong with anything. But several of the older soldiers who had grown up in the northern territories before joining Reveren's army refused to describe what they had seen and would only say, when pressed, that their grandmothers had told them about something like this once, a long time ago. When Sarath brought this report to Darius the following morning, Darius read it twice and set it aside. Mineral disturbance from the northern runoff, he said. Seasonal. I want a hydrographer to examine the upstream tributary. Of course, Serath said. There is also a second report. A village in the outer province, Aldenmere. Darius looked up. Aldenmere. The settlement from the punitive campaign, the rubble-strewn courtyard where he had found a silver-eyed woman sitting in the ash. What about it? Serath's face was carefully arranged into the expression of a soldier delivering information he does not know how to contextualize. The harvest. All of it. Every field, every crop, every store. It failed overnight. Not drought, not blight. The hydrographers cannot explain it. The grain is simply gone. Like something drew the life out of it at the root. Darius stared at the report in Serath's hand. Send assessment teams, he said. Agricultural failures happen. I want data, not speculation. Yes, my king. Serath left. Darius sat in the war chamber alone and felt, for the first time in 15 years of ruling, a sensation he had no name for. It was not fear. Fear he knew. Fear was a tool, a signal, something he had learned to read and respond to efficiently. This was different from fear the way cold water is different from ice, related, but transformed into something that moves through the body differently. This was the sensation of a mind that has built its entire architecture on a single premise, encountering the first evidence that the premise might be wrong. He went to the window. The sky above Ravarin was the color of old bone. The same color as yesterday. The same color as the morning he had made his decision. As if the sky, which noticed nothing and cared for nothing, had simply frozen in that particular shade and forgotten to move on. In the lower city, a woman named Elyra walked through the streets in the pre-dawn dark with her settlement coins in a cloth pouch, and her hands loose at her sides, and those silver eyes seeing everything and giving nothing away. She moved without urgency. She moved without visible destination. She moved the way water moves through a landscape it has been patient with for a very long time, not rushing, not forcing, simply finding the direction that gravity and time have made inevitable. She reached the city's eastern gate as the bone-colored dawn began to assert itself. The gate guards were junior men, young, not present at the formal proceeding in the Great Hall, not yet integrated into the system of whispers and implication that kept the court informed of everything important. They saw a young Omega woman in rough-spun clothes with a cloth pouch and silver eyes that gave them a feeling they would not be able to describe later, only report that they had let her pass without thinking to question it, as if the question had simply not arrived in their minds. She walked through the gate. She did not look back at the fortress. She walked east, into the pre-dawn light, into the flatlands beyond the capital where the roads were packed dirt, and the trees grew low and sideways from the wind that came off the northern highlands. She walked for 3 hours without stopping. At mid-morning, she reached a ridge overlooking a dry river basin, a watercourse that had been running since before Ravarin existed, before any kingdom had claimed this territory, before the history that was written in documents began, and she stopped. She stood at the edge of the ridge and looked down at the basin. She placed her right hand flat over her chest again. Over the place where a sealed thing lived, had lived for as long as she had been alive, had lived in her mother before her and her mother's mother before that, passed through generations like a stone passed from hand to hand, smooth with handling, heavy with accumulation. She felt it move. She had felt it moving for 3 days now, since the moment in the upper garden when Darius had said what he said, and she had felt the lock at the center of her chest give its first slow, deep shudder. She had understood immediately what that shudder meant. She had understood it in her blood and her bone before her mind had even caught up with the sensation. She had not been frightened. She was the last of the moon-bound keepers. Fear had been trained out of her line before she was born, not by courage, but by the weight of what they carried. When you carry something large enough, fear of it becomes irrelevant. What remains is simply the carrying, and what comes after the carrying ends. She closed her eyes. Beneath her feet, in the dry basin 60 feet below, the cracked riverbed began to darken. Not water, darker than water. The darkness spread outward from the center of the basin in a slow circle, a stain moving through stone, as if something below the surface of the earth was bleeding upward through the rock. The wind died. The bone-colored sky above her deepened, almost imperceptibly, the very faintest darkening at the edges of the horizon, the way afternoon moves toward evening except that it was mid-morning and nothing about the light should have been changing. Elyra opened her eyes. She looked at the darkness spreading through the basin below her, and her expression was the expression of someone watching something that has been asleep for a very long time stir at last toward waking. She did not look frightened. She looked almost relieved, which was, perhaps, the most terrifying thing of all. 300 miles north in the war chamber of the Thornheart fortress, a third report arrived on Darius's desk in the space of 2 hours. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. River anomalies in the eastern province. 3 entire farming settlements reporting crop failures with no identifiable natural cause. A garrison commander at the northern border writing that his wolves, trained war animals, the most psychologically hardened specimens in the kingdom's military stock, had refused to move from their kennels since dawn and were making sounds none of the handlers had heard in a decade of service. And then Sarath came in with the one that made Darius go still. "The village of Marin," Sarath said. His voice had lost its professional flatness. Something under it was shaking in a way that told Darius this was not a man delivering a report. This was a man trying to hold his composure around something that was dismantling it. "We've lost contact. The patrol sent to verify yesterday's reports reached the perimeter at midday. They found the village is gone, my king. Not destroyed, not burned, not flooded, gone. The ground where it stood is bare, like it was never there." The war chamber was very quiet. Darius looked at the report in Sarath's hand without taking it. "How many people in Marin?" he said. 800, roughly. 800, gone. Not destroyed, not displaced, gone, in the way a word disappears from a page when the ink fades. Not violent, not dramatic, simply no longer present where it was. He picked up the report. He read it once. He set it down. "Where is she?" he said. Sarath blinked. He understood immediately who the she was. "We tracked her to the eastern gate. She passed through at dawn." "We don't find her," Darius said. His voice was very quiet. In 15 years of commanding, Darius Thornheart had learned that the quieter his voice became, the more dangerous the thing it was communicating. He watched his lieutenant understand this. "Find her immediately, every resource. I want her location within the hour. Do not engage. Do not approach without my direct order. Find her and tell me where she is." Sarath left at a run. Darius sat in the empty war chamber. He thought about a village of 800 people that no longer existed. He thought about the dry river basin to the east, about the black water, about the crop failures with no cause, about the wolves in their kennels making sounds the handlers hadn't heard in a decade. He thought about a woman in a stone garden, reading him in 3 seconds the way the best of his generals couldn't in 3 hours. He thought about Silver Eyes closing, and opening different. He thought about the particular quality of those eyes in the Great Hall, when he had stood on the command dais and delivered the formal severing in front of 400 witnesses and called her a mistake. He had told himself he felt nothing. He sat in the war chamber now with reports of an impossible, spreading destruction on his desk, and understood, with the sudden, complete clarity that only genuine crisis delivers, that he had been lying to himself. That in the stone garden and the great hall, he had felt something enormous, something structural, something that had been forming for 8 months in the deep core of him under all the layers of crown and strategy and deliberate steel, and that he had named it weakness and excised it with surgical deliberation, and in doing so had made the specific choice that a specific bloodline had been waiting, for centuries, for him to make. The Keldrath coalition had been afraid of a weakened king. They had gotten something infinitely worse. They had gotten a king who had strengthened himself in exactly the wrong direction. The first crack appeared in the eastern wall of the Thornheart fortress at sunset. Not structural, not of the kind of crack that engineers worried about. A hairline fracture in the basalt, perhaps 3 feet long, running from floor to ceiling in the corridor outside the war chamber. One of the fortress housekeeping staff found it while lighting the evening torches and reported it to the day captain, who reported it to Sarath, who brought it to Darius with the specific expression of a man who has run out of ways to categorize what he is witnessing. The crack was dry. No water behind it, no pressure from the earth. It had simply appeared. Darius pressed his fingers to the stone on either side of it and felt nothing, no vibration, no moisture, no heat or cold that didn't belong there. Only the crack. Running through the basalt of the Thornheart wall like a sentence written in a language he hadn't learned yet. He stood in the corridor with the torchlight flickering and the crack in the wall and the smell of old stone around him, and he felt the machinery of his mind, the cold, precise, strategy-optimized machinery he had spent 15 years perfecting. Attempt to find a frame for what was happening. Attempt to reduce it to accessible variables and actionable responses. Attempt to do what it was built to do. It couldn't, because what was happening was not a strategic problem. It was a consequence. And consequences, unlike enemies, cannot be outmaneuvered. They can only be faced. Sarath appeared at the end of the corridor. His face told the story before he spoke. "We found her," he said. "Eastern Ridge, above the Moran Basin." "And?" Darius said. Sarath looked at the crack in the wall, looked back at Darius. "My king, the basin in." He stopped, started again. "The basin is gone. The ground where it was is bare, like it was never—" He stopped because Darius was already moving fast, in the direction of the stables, in the direction of east, in the direction of a woman standing on a ridge above a vanished geography, her hand pressed over the sealed place in her chest, where something ancient and terrible and patient had just decided that patience was finished. Behind him, in the stone corridor of the Thornheart fortress, the hairline crack in the basalt wall widened by exactly half an inch. And from somewhere deep beneath the foundations, beneath the stones that Darius's ancestors had laid on the bones of a people they had erased from the world, something moved. Something that had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. And it was only just beginning to wake up. He rode east with 6 men and no plan. That was the thing Darius Thornheart could not have explained to any of the generals he had left behind in the fortress, the absence of a plan. In 15 years of ruling, he had never moved toward anything without a strategic architecture already constructed around the objective. Every campaign had its formations. Every negotiation had its fallback positions. Every decision, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones, had been preceded by the cold and meticulous process of identifying the desired outcome and working backward from it through every obstacle between here and there. He was riding east with 6 men, and the only thing in his head was the word she. The bone-colored sky had deepened into something that wasn't quite the purple of evening and wasn't quite the gray of storm. It occupied the uncomfortable territory between those two things, the way certain silences occupy the space between speech and violence. The torches the men carried threw light that bent wrong in the air around them, flames leaning without wind, as if the atmosphere itself had developed an opinion about the direction this party was traveling and was registering its objection through the only mechanism available to fire. Sarath rode a half-length behind Darius's left shoulder. He had not spoken since the fortress gate. The other 5 men, senior guards, the most experienced Darius had, men who had seen battle and survived it with their composure mostly intact, rode in the particular silence of soldiers who have been trained not to voice what they are feeling, but whose bodies are voicing it anyway. In the set of their spines and the angle of their eyes, and the way their hands kept moving to the hilts of weapons that would be entirely useless against whatever was happening to their kingdom. 3 miles out from the capital, they passed through the village of Anther, or rather, they passed through where Anther had been. Darius pulled his horse to a stop. The 6 men stopped behind him. The road ran through what should have been Anther's main approach, the packed dirt track flanked by the low stone fences of its outer farms. Then the settlement itself, 200 people, a mill, a garrison post, the particular smell of a working village at evening, wood smoke and animal, and the dense organic warmth of human habitation. There was nothing, not ruins, not ash, not the aftermath of any catastrophe his mind knew how to categorize. The ground was bare, not barren. It was not salted or blasted or fouled in any visible way. It was simply bare in the way ground is bare before anything is built on it. As if Anther had never existed, as if the idea of Anther had been removed from the physical world the way a word is removed from a sentence, leaving only the surrounding context to imply the gap. One of the guards behind him made a sound, low, involuntary, the kind of sound a man makes when his body processes something his mind has not yet agreed to acknowledge. "Keep moving," Darius said. His voice was very quiet. Nobody argued. They kept moving. The ridge above the Moran Basin took another 40 minutes of hard riding through the landscape that was changing around them as they moved through it. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have triggered an immediate response, but in the accumulative, creeping fashion of something that was proceeding at its own pace and had no need to be noticed. The low trees on either side of the road were wrong in some quality of their stillness. The night insects that should have been audible in the grass margins were not. The temperature was dropping in a way that bore no relationship to the hour or the season. They smelled the basin before they saw it. Or rather, they smelled the absence of the basin. Stone and mineral and the cold water smell of deep geology exposed to air. The particular scent of earth that has been unconfined from something that used to contain it. A smell that belonged underground, not on the surface. They came over the ridge approach at a canter and pulled up hard at the edge. The Moran Basin was gone. Not collapsed, not flooded, not altered in any of the ways geology does alter basins, through sedimentation or drought, or the slow rewriting of drainage patterns over centuries. It was simply not there. Where the basin had been, where 60 feet of descent had carved a dry river channel through the eastern geography of Ravaran for as long as any record showed, there was flat ground, continuous with the ridge, as if the basin had never been a feature of the landscape at all. As if this particular piece of geography had been edited out of the physical world by the same mechanism that had removed Anther's 200 people. Srath made no sound. Neither did the guards. Darius looked at the flat ground where the basin had been and felt the last remnants of his strategic framework give way to something rawer and more honest. Not panic. He had never panicked in his life and was not about to begin. But the specific clarifying cold of a man who has just realized that the problem in front of him is categorically different from any problem he has encountered before. That the rules he had learned, the tactics, the leverage, the understanding of human motivation and institutional power that had built everything he owned, were not applicable here. That he was going to have to think in a language he had never learned. "She's there," Sarath said quietly. Darius looked where Sarath was looking. She stood perhaps 300 yards along the ridge, at the point where the flat ground that had replaced the basin met the original terrain. She stood absolutely still with her back to them and her face toward whatever was east of there, the outer provinces, the territories that paid Ravaran tribute, the edges of the kingdom that his ancestors had built on this particular piece of the world. Her hair was moving. There was no wind. "Stay here," Darius said. "My king, stay here." He dismounted, left his horse with Sarath, walked along the ridge toward her on foot, alone, across ground that felt different underfoot than ground had any right to feel, not unstable, not threatening, simply other, as if the fundamental quality of the earth had shifted into a register that human feet were not entirely equipped to interpret correctly. He was 30 feet from her when she spoke. She said, "Don't." He stopped. Her voice was a sound he had no preparation for. After 8 months of silence, 8 months of gestures and silver eyes, and the complete devastating grammar of a body that had learned to communicate without the instrument of speech, her voice arriving in the air between them was like a physical impact, low and rough from disuse, carrying in it the texture of something that had been sealed for a very long time and was now, for the first time, being released. A voice that sounded like it had been waiting. He did not move forward. He did not step back. He stood on the ridge in the wrong temperatured air with the flat ground where a basin used to be on his left, and the woman who had not spoken in all the time he'd known her now speaking. And he made himself stay with the impact of it without reacting to it, the way he had trained himself to receive bad news in front of subordinates. "Elyra," he said, "don't say my name." Her voice did not shake. It was steady in the way of something that has made its decision and arrived at the far side of all the uncertainty surrounding that decision into a place of strange, bleak peace. "You don't get to say it like that. Not now." He absorbed this. "You need to stop what you're doing," he said. She turned. He had seen her face in every emotional register her silence allowed. He had become, over 8 months, an expert reader of every nuance her expression could carry. He had thought he understood the range of what her face was capable of. He had not seen this. The silver eyes were luminous in a way they had not been before. Not glowing, not supernatural in any visible or theatrical sense. But the depth in them had achieved something, a completeness, a full, opened quality, as if whatever had been sealed in her had been the thing that limited those eyes to merely silver. And now that the seal was cracking, they were becoming something more than color, something you could not look away from. Something that looked back at you from a distance that was measured in centuries rather than feet. "Stop," she repeated. Her voice carried in it something almost like amusement. Almost. The cousin of amusement that lives on the other side of grief. "Do you understand what you're asking me to stop?" "Tell me," Darius said. "You're a king. Think like one." She took 3 steps toward him and stopped, 20 feet between them now, close enough that he could see the particular quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of someone at rest, but the stillness of something enormous moving so slowly it only appears still. "Your ancestors took this land. You know this. Every child born in Ravarin knows this. It's the founding story you tell yourselves to make the taking feel like destiny." "The moonbound bloodline," he said. Something moved across her face, quick and involuntary, the reflex of a person who did not expect the name. "You found the records," she said. "I found enough." He had not in fact found enough. He had found fragments in the fortress archive over the past 3 days, references buried in genealogical records that his ancestors had clearly attempted to obscure, references to a bloodline that predated Ravarin's founding, to a curse enacted at the moment of that founding, to a condition that had been attached to that curse involving a lock and a key and an heir. He had not found the specifics. He was looking at the specifics now. You were the seal, your heart was the lock. "My heart was the lock," she confirmed. Her voice was perfectly level. "And you broke it." The wind that wasn't there moved her hair again. "How do I stop it?" he said. And here was the thing that happened in Darius Thornheart in that moment. The thing that nobody who had spent 15 years fearing him would have predicted. The thing that his generals and his council and the Keldrath lords who had thought they understood his psychology would not have known how to categorize. The question came out of him without strategy, without the framework of leverage or negotiation that had surrounded every question he had ever asked anyone in a position of power. It came out the way a question comes out of someone who has just realized they are not in a position of power at all. Raw, direct, without architecture. How do I stop it? Not how do I defeat it or contain it or negotiate around it. How do I stop it? A question a man asks when he understands that the only person who has the answer is the person he hurt. Elyra looked at him for a long time. "You can't," she said. "Elyra, the curse doesn't have a mechanism for stopping. It has a mechanism for completion." Her jaw tightened, the first visible crack in the steadiness of her voice, a hairline fracture matching the one in his fortress wall. It was designed that way, by someone who understood that people like your ancestors, people like you, would spend eternity looking for the loophole, the exception, the tactical workaround, so they didn't leave one. Darius stood in the growing cold and absorbed this. He was a man who had encountered walls before, real walls, fortified walls, walls that had taken months of siege and engineering and attrition to breach. He had always breached them. He had built his entire identity on the premise that every barrier yields to sufficient force applied with sufficient intelligence. He was looking at a wall made of something that force could not touch and intelligence could not map. "Then what happens?" he said. "The kingdom continues to disappear," she said, "village by village, province by province, settlement by settlement. The geography reverts, the people—" She stopped. Her eyes moved briefly away from his, not in evasion, but in the particular sideways movement of someone who is making themselves look at something they would prefer not to. "The people don't die. They're not destroyed. They simply cease to have occurred in this place. The land forgets them, the way your ancestors forced the land to forget mine. 800 people in Marin, 200 in Anther, and he had 11 provinces. He did it quickly, the way he did all unwelcome calculations, so the full number arrived in his mind before his resistance to it could construct defenses. 50,000 warriors garrisoned across the kingdom, the civilians they protected, the settlements, the capital city. "How long?" he said. "Faster than you want," she said. "Slower than I probably deserve." The almost amusement again, its cruel cousin. "Your capital has days, maybe less." Darius looked at her. He had looked at her 10,000 times in 8 months and thought he understood the architecture of what he was seeing. A woman, an omega, someone outside the structures of his world who had found her way inside it and changed something in him that he had not wanted changed and had eventually been terrified enough to excise. He had looked at her and seen complexity and depth and a kind of intelligence that his framework had no proper category for, and he had called all of that a weakness. He was looking at her now and understanding for the first time what she actually was. Not just a woman, not just the last heir of a bloodline. The closing mechanism of a sentence that his ancestors had started and assumed they had escaped the ending of. The specific person the universe, or fate, or the deliberate will of the people his bloodline had destroyed. The specific person that entire architecture of consequence had been waiting to position in exactly this place. Here, in front of him. After 8 months of proximity that had been something real, something that had changed him in ways he had refused to name. The universe, or whatever force had designed this, had a vicious sense of irony. It had not sent the curse in the form of an army or a plague or a rival king. It had sent it in the form of a woman who asked for nothing and gave everything and made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, like a human being rather than a machine for producing power. And then it had waited for him to destroy her. He wanted to say something enormous, something proportionate to the scale of what he was understanding in this moment. He was not, had never been, a man of large emotional declarations. His whole life had been built on the compression of feeling into function, on the belief that what you didn't name couldn't be turned against you. What came out of him was small, smaller than the moment deserved. "I was wrong," he said. Elyra looked at him. "In the garden," he said. "In the hall. Everything I said. Everything I decided." He stopped, made himself continue, because stopping now was the coward's option, and he had earned the obligation to be honest with her regardless of what it cost him. "I was afraid. The council, the coalition, the whispers about weakness. I told myself it was strategy, that it was a necessary calculation. I told myself that right up until the moment I said it in front of 400 people and watched your face." He paused. "I knew before the words finished leaving my mouth. I knew it was wrong." "You knew?" she said. "Yes. And you said it anyway." "Yes." The silence between them was specific. It was not the comfortable silence of two people who have reached an understanding. It was the silence of a chasm between two cliff faces, deep and real, and not crossable by the kind of bridge that can be built in a single conversation. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "You want me to stop it. I told you it can't be stopped. So what is this? Strategy? An apology designed to produce a result?" He said nothing for a moment, because the honest answer was that he didn't know, that he was standing on a ridge in an increasingly dark and wrong-temperatured evening, telling a woman who had the capacity to erase his entire kingdom that he had been wrong, and he could not cleanly identify whether the impulse driving that confession was tactical or genuine, because in 15 years of being a king, he had trained those two things so thoroughly into each other that he no longer had reliable access to the seam between them. "I don't know," he said. She blinked. Of all the things he could have said, this was apparently not what she had expected. "You don't know," she repeated. "I have spent 15 years making sure I always know why I do everything. I always know the calculation. I always know the objective." He looked at her with the specific directness he usually reserved for generals he was about to relieve of command. Eye contact held past the point where most people broke it. Not aggressive, but utterly without deflection. "I'm standing here telling you I was wrong, and I cannot tell you with certainty whether I'm doing it because I need you to stop this, or because it's true and you deserve to hear it, or because the truth is it's both those things simultaneously and I don't know how to separate them. I am telling you I don't know. That is the most honest thing I have said out loud in years." The luminous silver eyes held him. He could feel her reading him. The full, complete read that she had always performed on him. The one that took in everything, posture and breath, and the quality of his eye contact and whatever the body says underneath all the things the mind is trying to control. He had always found it unsettling in the way that things you cannot deceive are unsettling. He found it unsettling now for a different reason. He found it unsettling because he wanted badly to pass. He did not know if he was passing. He did not know if passing was possible after what he had done. "Go back to your fortress," she said finally. Something in his chest, a compression, a tightening of something that had been specifically trained to remain loose. "Elyra, I need you to go back." Her voice had dropped, not in volume, but in register. Something in it had changed, had moved from the cold steadiness of the first part of this conversation into something else. Something that she was managing with the same disciplined care with which he had always managed his own unwelcome feelings. "Because I can't," she stopped. The jaw tightened again. The hairline fracture in her steadiness widened by a fraction. "If you stay here, I can't think clearly. And I need to think clearly. Because you're right that something is happening, and I am not certain it should be happening. Not like this. Not at this speed." He went very still. "What does that mean?" he said carefully. "It means the curse is older than I am, and I have lived my entire life being told I was simply the vessel for it. That I carried it, and when the time came, I would not have a choice in what happened next." She pressed her right hand flat over her chest, over the place she had pressed it in the garden and in the great hall, but the gesture was different now. Not communicative, not farewell. Something closer to a hand pressed against a wound, feeling the pulse of it, assessing. "I was told I had no agency in this, that the lock would break and the consequence would follow, and I was not a participant. I was a mechanism." The word mechanism hung in the evening air between them. Darius thought about everything he had just said to her about 15 years of making himself a machine for producing power, about training feeling into function until the seam between them was invisible even to himself. Something in the space between them shifted, not closing. The chasm was still there, deep and real. But the nature of it changed. A bridge was not possible, but a rope might be. Something temporary and inadequate and requiring constant effort to maintain, but capable of carrying a voice across the gap. "You have a choice," he said. "I don't know that," she said. "The women in my line did not live long enough to know that. They all died before the seal was tested. I am the first to survive to this moment." "Then you're the first to find out." Her eyes cut to his, sharp, raw. Something in them that had not been visible before. Not the ancient patience, not the luminous steadiness, but something underneath both of those. Something that was simply a 20-year-old woman who had been carrying an impossible weight since before she understood what weight was. "That's easy for you to say," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is. Go back," she said again. "Send everyone away from the capital. Not because I am not making you promises. I am not agreeing to anything. But if I'm going to spend the next hours determining whether I have any capacity to affect what's happening, I cannot do that with you 300 yards away." A breath, rough and quick, the most uncontrolled thing she had let him see. "You have always made it difficult for me to think clearly." He registered this. He did not allow himself to register it fully, because the situation did not permit him to be fully in his own feelings about what she had just said. He compartmentalized it into the place where he kept everything that required later examination. He was aware the place was overfull. "If you send the capital to safety," she said, "if you begin that immediately, then when I determine whether there is a choice available to me, when I find that out, the people will not be the currency. The geography, the stones, the history your family claimed, that's already gone. More will go. But if the people are out of the radius, then what remains is an argument between bloodlines." Her voice dropped again to something almost too quiet to carry. "And those are the only arguments worth having." The wind that was not wind moved between them. Darius looked at this woman who had sat through 8 months of his worst hours and never asked for anything, who had just spoken for the first time in his presence with a voice that sounded like it had been stored against an enormous occasion, who was standing on a ridge above an erased river basin, telling him she was not certain she had been told the truth about herself. He made a decision, not a strategic decision, not a calculation of outcomes, a decision of a different kind, the kind that cost him something in the making of it, that required him to put down the framework he had always operated in and operate without it. "I'll send word immediately," he said. "Full evacuation, capital and all northern settlements within the hour." "That's not enough time to—" "It will have to be." She looked at him. "When it's done," he said, "I'm coming back." Something in her face, not softening, not closing, something in the territory between those two things that was difficult to read. "I haven't agreed to anything." "I know." "I'm not promising you." "I know," he said again, and the repetition of it was quieter than the first time. Something in it that was about the conversation they were not quite having, the thing that lived in the space between what was being said and what was underneath it. I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm telling you I'm coming back. What you do with that is yours. He turned and walked back to where Serath and the guards were waiting. He could feel her eyes on his back the entire distance. The evacuation of Ravaran's capital took place in the hours before dawn. It was not orderly. Orderly was a standard that applied to evacuations that had been planned, drilled, anticipated. This was none of those things. What it was, in the absence of order, was testament to something less polished and more real. The deep, wordless communication of a population that had lived for 15 years under a king who had never been wrong about a threat assessment. When Darius Thornheart looked at you with that particular expression and said move, you moved. You did not ask the questions yet. The questions were for later, when you were already moving. They went northwest toward the open highland settlements that were far enough from the progression of erasure that the calculations Darius had made on the hard ride back to the capital suggested they would be outside the radius. He had no certainty in those calculations. He was working from incomplete data, from the pattern of what had vanished and what had not, from the specific geography of what the curse appeared to be doing, which was, as near as he could determine, moving outward from Elyra's position on the eastern ridge in concentric circles that consumed Ravaran's claimed territory in an order that suggested some deliberate logic. The deliberate logic appeared to be oldest first, the territories his ancestors had taken first. The foundation settlements, the geographic core of the original claim, those were disappearing fastest. The outer territories, the more recently acquired, were still intact, which meant the capital, which was the oldest of all, the original seat of Thornheart power built on the exact ground where the moonbound bloodline had been destroyed centuries ago. The capital was the specific destination of the curse. The bullseye. Holt rode beside him on the evacuation route, the old general's face carrying the expression of a man who had revised his worldview substantially in the past 6 hours and was still in the process of integrating the revision. The girl, Holt said. He had been silent for 2 miles. She's the source. She's the vessel, Darius said. There's a difference. I don't know what that difference is in practical terms. The difference is she's uncertain whether she can stop it. Darius watched the column of evacuees moving through the pre-dawn dark, torchlight on several thousand faces carrying only what they could carry, the particular compressed silence of people who have suspended the full weight of their fear for later. She's looking for a choice. We are going to give her the conditions to find it. Holt was quiet for a moment. We gave her very few choices before now, he said. No, Darius said. We did not. The silence between the two men was the silence of people who have arrived at the same conclusion through different routes and have nothing to gain from elaborating it further. The Keldrath Coalition, Holt said eventually, the tactician in him unable to remain entirely in the philosophical register. When they learn what's happening, they'll advance, Darius said. They've been waiting for an opening. A king evacuating his own capital is an opening. And your response? Darius looked ahead at the column. At the faces, at the people who were moving through the dark because he had told them to move, on trust he had not yet fully earned back from himself. My response, he said, is that the Keldrath Coalition is the least interesting problem I have right now. Holt looked at him. When did that happen? The old general said quietly. Darius did not answer. He rode at the front of the column through the rest of the pre-dawn dark, and behind him, Ravaran's capital city, the oldest, deepest seat of Thornheart power, the stones his great-great-grandfather had laid on the bones of a people his great-great-grandfather had erased, began, slowly and without drama, to become something other than what it had been. Not rubble, not ruin, simply no longer there. By the time the column reached the highland settlements and the evacuation resolved into the controlled chaos of 10,000 displaced people and the logistical nightmare of shelter and provision, the sun had risen into a sky that was still the color of old bone, but beginning, at its eastern edge, to show the very faintest thread of something warmer. Darius stood at the highland's edge and looked back toward where the capital had been. He could not see it from this distance. He would not have been able to see it regardless, in the morning haze. But he knew, with the specific physical certainty of a man who had looked at his own kingdom every morning for 15 years, that what was in the direction he was looking had changed. What his ancestors had taken was being given back. He did not know if he had the right to stop that. He did not know if he could. He did not know if the woman on the eastern ridge had found her answer yet, whether she had discovered, in the careful examination of something she had been told all her life was sealed and fated and beyond her agency, any evidence of a different truth. He knew he was going back to find out. He turned from the highland's edge and found Holt behind him. "Take command of the settlement," Darius said. "Resources, shelter, the garrison. Whatever the Keldrath moves are, hold our people in the highlands and out of range. You know how." Holt looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who had followed this particular king into enough impossible situations to have developed a fairly reliable intuition about which ones he was going to survive. "Come back," Holt said. "That's the plan," Darius said. He took one horse, no guards, no formation. He rode back east, alone, through a landscape that was in the process of remembering what it had been before a king claimed it. The road dissolved beneath him a mile out from the capital's former perimeter. Not in front of him, not as a barrier, but behind him, disappearing as he moved forward, as if the curse was following the erasure to its source, and he was moving just fast enough to stay ahead of it. He rode harder. The eastern ridge came up in the mid-morning light, and he saw her before he was close enough to read her expression clearly. A figure standing at the ridge's edge, exactly where he had left her, but different in some quality of her presence. The hair moving in the absent wind was stiller now. The particular quality of the air around her had changed from the enormous building pressure of the hours before to something that was still enormous but different in its character. He pulled the horse up and dismounted and walked the last 100 yards. She turned before he reached her. The silver eyes were wet, not crying, not tears running. The eyes of someone who had been crying recently enough that the evidence remained, who had stopped crying not because the reason for it had passed, but because she had moved through the crying into something on the other side of it. He stopped 10 feet from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Did you find your answer?" he said. She looked at him. "I found something," she said. "It's not an answer, it's a condition." Her jaw worked once. "The curse runs on grief. My family understood that. They encoded it that way deliberately because grief is the only human force they knew would outlast everything else. Kingdoms, armies, time. Grief doesn't exhaust itself. It only transforms." She pressed her hand over her chest. What they may not have fully understood, or what they chose to believe didn't matter, is that the same force that powers the curse is the same force that can redirect it. The silver eyes held him. "Forgiveness." Darius went still. "The grief that broke the seal," she said, "was mine. Which means the only person whose forgiveness could affect what the grief is doing is also mine." She watched his face. "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. This is not a solution. This is not an easy thing. I am telling you that I have a choice that I was not told I had, and that choice is genuinely mine, and that it is not simple, and I am not ready to make it yet." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Because in my experience, kings hear what they want to hear." "In my experience," he said, "people who have been hurt enough to justify anything are the only ones capable of genuinely choosing not to." She looked at him. The morning light moved across the ridge. In the distance, in the direction of the capital that no longer existed, a sound came. Not dramatic, not the thunder of collapse or the crack of destruction, but something quieter and more final. The sound of something very old returning to itself, something it had been before a king with iron ambition and a long memory for territory decided it belonged to him. The sound moved through both of them. Elyra closed her eyes, and in the deep place beneath her ribs, in the sealed space that had been cracking for 3 days and was now fully open, in the architecture of a curse built from grief that was built from love that was built from loss, she felt something she had not expected to find. A door. Not out. Through. She opened her eyes and looked at the man who had broken her. "If I do this," she said slowly, and the "if" was the most dangerous word he had ever heard, the "if" of a choice genuinely available. The "if" that meant nothing was decided yet and everything was still possible, including the wrong thing. "If I decide to try, It will not save the kingdom. I know, he said. The destruction is not reversible. What's gone is gone. I know. You would lose everything your family built. My family built it on something that didn't belong to them, he said. That's not loss, that's accounting. She looked at him for a long moment with those wet silver eyes, and all the ancient weight behind them, and the 20-year-old woman somewhere underneath all of that who had been told her whole life she was a mechanism and had just discovered she was something else. I hate that you're saying the right things, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. The first real crack, full and audible. I hate that you're standing here saying the right things after everything I did, he said. Yes, I know, he said for the third time. And the third time was the one that cost him the most, because it contained in it the full acknowledgement not of what had happened, but of what it meant. That saying the right things now did not undo what had been said before. That understanding he had been wrong was not the same as undoing the wrongness. That he was going to have to live in the space between those two things for a very long time, possibly forever. He knew. And she knew he knew. And in the space between their knowing, something shifted in the quality of what had been between them. Not toward resolution, not toward forgiveness, not toward any of the clean outcomes that stories about people like them usually move toward something rawer than that, toward the genuine possibility of a different kind of truth. Then the ground moved, not the ground on the ridge, not the ground between them. The ground in the far distance, the northeast, the direction of the upper provinces, the territories that had not yet been touched by the spreading erasure. It moved with a sound like something very large deciding it had waited long enough. Elyra's eyes moved northeast with the sharpness of someone receiving information through a channel that was not sound or sight. Her face changed. That's not the curse, she said. What is it? Darius said. She looked at him with an expression that contained several things at once. The complexity of a person standing at a genuine crossroads, looking at the path they chose and the paths they didn't, understanding that all the paths have costs. The Keldrath Coalition, she said. They're advancing. They didn't wait. Of course they hadn't. Of course they had read the evacuation as the signal Holt had predicted. Of course, the moment that looked like Ravarin's king had lost control was the moment 3 allied kingdoms with accumulated grudges and long memories decided the timing was right. Darius looked northeast. He looked back at Elyra. He was standing between two things that would each destroy everything, one from the past, moving outward through a grief older than the kingdom itself, and one from the present, marching forward through the specific political logic of men who confuse timing with destiny. And in the middle of those two forces stood a woman who had just told him she had a choice. She had not known she had, and had not yet decided whether to make it. A woman whose next decision, made or unmade, taken or refused, would determine whether there was anything left worth the name of Ravarin, or worth the name of something else, something that had not yet been named. The ground moved again in the northeast, and this time it carried in it the specific tremor of marching feet, thousands of them, and the Keldrath banners would be visible from the highland settlements where Holt was already managing 10,000 displaced people with no defensive position and no king. Darius Thornheart stood on the eastern ridge between a curse and an army with nothing in his hands that had ever mattered. No throne, no crown, no fortress, no force, and looked at the silver-eyed woman who was not yet his salvation and not yet his ending, and understood that the next thing he did was going to be the most important thing he had ever done in his life, and that he had no idea what it was. The ground shook again, and this time the sound it carried was unmistakable, not geological, not the deep, impersonal tremor of the earth adjusting its own weight in the absence of what had been built on it. This was the percussion of organized human force, the particular rhythm of an army that has been marching long enough to move as a single body, feet hitting ground in the staggered synchrony of 10,000 men who have been told they are walking towards something that belongs to them now. Darius knew the sound of an advancing army. He had been the source of it often enough to recognize it from the receiving end, and what he recognized now in the northeast was not a border probe or a punitive column. This was a full campaign advance. The Keldrath Coalition had moved their main force. They had not waited to confirm what the evacuation meant. They had decided that an evacuating king was close enough to a defeated king to act on without further verification. How far? Elyra said. She had turned northeast with the same focused attention she brought to everything, reading the sound with those silver eyes in the way she read all sensory information, completely, without filtering for what she wanted it to mean. "The sound carries in the morning air," Darius said. 6 hours, maybe 7. He was already moving through the calculation, the part of his mind that had spent 15 years in strategic architecture doing the work it was built to do, even as the rest of him was still absorbing everything the last hour had required of him. Holt is at the Highland settlements with 10,000 civilians, a garrisoned force that's been fractured by the evacuation, and no defensive position worth the name. "Then you need to go," she said. "I know." He did not move. "Elyra?" I said, "I haven't decided anything." Her voice was steady again, the crack sealed back over with the discipline of someone who had been managing enormous things alone for a very long time. "I'm telling you that decision is still mine to make. What happens with the army is yours." He looked at her for 2 seconds. He memorized the specifics of her face in this light, in this moment. Not sentimentally, not with any quality of farewell, but the way a man memorizes tactical geography before a campaign, because it mattered and he needed to carry it accurately. "I'll be back," he said. He turned and rode northwest at a dead gallop. The Highland settlements came up in 40 minutes of riding that ate through the horse's reserves and left the animal blowing hard and dark with sweat. Darius was off its back before it fully stopped, moving through the outer perimeter of the camp with the stride of a man who has re-entered his operational register and is not stopping for anything that isn't the specific thing he needs. He found Holt at the settlement's northern edge. What he found with Holt stopped him. 3 men he did not immediately recognize were standing with the old general. Not the posture of soldiers in Holt's command, but something different. Something in the angle of their bodies, the specific quality of their stillness that registered in Darius's threat assessment before his conscious mind had caught up with what it was seeing. Holt's face, when he turned, carried an expression that Darius had seen on that face in 15 years of campaigning exactly twice. The expression of a man who has just survived something that he did not survive cleanly. "My king," Holt said. "Who are these men?" Darius said. The 3 men resolved, as Darius got closer, into specific identities. 2 he recognized as senior aides from the Keldrath diplomatic mission that had maintained a presence in the capital. Men he had seen in formal settings, faces he knew, in the way you know the faces of people you have filed under future problems. The 3rd man he had never seen before, but the insignia on his outer coat was Keldrath command rank. A Keldrath commander was standing inside his evacuation camp. The cold that moved through Darius was not the cold of the wrong-temperatured air. "General Holt received us under flag of communication," the commander said. He was perhaps 45, steady-faced, with the specific demeanor of a man who has been sent to deliver a message rather than to negotiate, who has been told exactly what to say and has no authority to deviate from it. "I am Commandant Ferris, 2nd Command of the Keldrath United Advance. I carry terms." "Terms," Darius said. "Surrender terms," Ferris said. "The coalition has assessed the situation in Riverin and concluded that continued military engagement serves no one's interest. The kingdom is—" He paused with the careful precision of a man choosing words that are technically accurate while carrying the maximum weight of what he means. "The kingdom is experiencing a significant reduction in its territorial integrity. The coalition's position is that the moment presents an opportunity for a settlement that avoids further loss of life." Darius looked at Holt. Holt's expression had not changed, the survived something uncleanly look. Still there. Darius held the look for a moment longer than necessary, held it with the patience of a man who has learned to read what is being communicated beneath the surface of what is being said, and what he read in Holt's face was not simple. "Leave us," Darius said to the Keldrath men. Ferris didn't move. "My communication is addressed to the Thornheart seat in—" "Leave us," Darius said again, and the second time was so absolutely without the quality of a request that Ferris and his 2 aides walked 20 feet away without appearing to consciously decide to do so. Darius turned to Holt. "Talk," he said. Holt was silent for a moment. The silence of a man finishing the internal argument that had clearly been running in him since before Darius arrived. "They contacted me 4 hours ago," Holt said. "Not Ferris. Different men. Different channel. Private channel. His jaw worked. They had information about the source of what's happening to the kingdom, about the girl. He met Darius's eyes. About what she is. They knew Darius. Not general knowledge. Specific knowledge. The moonbound bloodline. The curse mechanics. The seal. They had sources in our archive apparently going back years. Darius stayed very still. And, he said, and their proposal was not the surrender terms Ferris is carrying. Holt's voice had dropped to the register he used for things he did not want overheard. Their real proposal was a separate arrangement, private, between their command and our garrison leadership. He stopped. Say it, Darius said. They want the girl, Holt said. In exchange for withdrawal of the coalition forces, guaranteed security for Ravaran's displaced population, and a formal treaty restoring a reduced version of Thornheart territorial claim in the outer provinces. They want her delivered to their custody. They believe she can be... He stopped again. The word he was working toward was clearly one he found difficult to produce. Contained, used. Their scholars apparently believe that if the last moonbound heir is held and the seal can be re-engaged under controlled conditions, the curse can be weaponized rather than allowed to run its course. The morning air was very still. Somewhere in the settlement behind them, the sounds of 10,000 displaced people going about the controlled chaos of an improvised camp continued, ordinary and human, and completely unaware of the conversation happening at their perimeter. Darius said nothing for 8 seconds. He counted them. It was a technique he had developed early in his rule, in the first years when he was young enough that rage still had physical access to his face before he could stop it. Count 8 seconds. Let the initial wave move through and past. Respond from what was underneath the wave rather than from the wave itself. 8 seconds. You said they contacted garrison leadership, he said. Holt looked at him. Who agreed, Darius said. Another silence. Longer this time. The silence of a man at the far end of a very difficult set of hours, a man who had clearly spent those hours making a series of decisions that he had known would need to be accounted for, who was now in the moment of that accounting and finding it exactly as hard as he had anticipated. Sarath, Holt said, and 4 of the 6 senior garrison commanders. Sarath. The name arrived and Darius received it. He received it in the specific way that news of betrayal from a trusted source arrives. Not with the shock of something genuinely surprising, because nothing is genuinely surprising once you have enough experience with human nature under pressure, but with the particular weight of something you had not permitted yourself to fully anticipate, because anticipating it would have required a level of mistrust that was incompatible with effective command. Sarath, who had ridden with him into the Aldenmere campaign. Sarath, who had been the one to gesture at the silver-eyed woman in the rubble-strewn courtyard with the casual dismissiveness of someone doing a threat assessment and coming up empty. Sarath, who had executed the evacuation order with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for the king to give him a reason to move the pieces where he needed them. Where are they now? Darius said. They rode east 2 hours ago, Holt said, with 12 men. They know where she is, Darius. Sarath tracked her yesterday before you left to find her. He knew the ridge. The 8-second count was not going to be sufficient. Darius turned from Holt and took 3 steps away from the conversation and stood facing the eastern horizon. And what he felt in those 3 steps was not the cold strategic clarity he had been trained to access under pressure. It was something rawer and less organized and much more honest. The particular internal upheaval of a man who has just realized that the thing he was most afraid of losing has been moved toward by people he trusted while he was standing in front of it, confessing things he had never confessed to anyone. She was on that ridge. She had told him she had not yet decided. She had told him the decision was genuinely hers. And he had left her there alone because he had trusted the perimeter his own men controlled. How far ahead are they? He said. His voice was very quiet. 2 hours, Holt said. Maybe less. They're moving fast, but they don't know the ground east of the capital perimeter the way. Darius was already walking toward the horses. My king. Holt's voice behind him carried the particular tone of a man who is about to say something that will cost him. I did not agree to their proposal. When Sarath presented the arrangement to me, I refused. I want that stated clearly. Darius stopped walking. He turned. The thing about Holt, the specific, irreducible thing about Varen Holt, that had made him worth keeping through 15 years of campaigns and council arguments, and all the difficult loyalty math that came with being a senior commander to a king who was not easy to serve, was that he had always been honest, even when honesty was the harder choice. Not because honesty was his nature particularly, because he had made a decision somewhere in his career that a man who could not tell the truth to the people he served was a liability rather than an asset, and he had held to that decision with the same stubbornness he held to tactical positions. He had refused Sarath's arrangement. He had allowed the approach to proceed far enough to gather the information, and then he had refused it. That was not a clean record, but it was an honest one. "I know," Darius said. He turned back toward the horses. "Darius." First name, no title. The way the old general had spoken to him in the very early years, before the throne fully calcified the distance between them. "You're riding into a situation where your own men are moving against you, and a Keldrath advance is 6 hours behind. You have no force. You have no position. What you have is a king's authority that means nothing right now, and a situation that cannot be resolved by the things that authority is designed to do." "I know that too," Darius said. "What exactly is the plan?" Darius looked at the old general across the morning light. "Get there first," he said. He rode east with nothing. The understanding of betrayal does something specific to a man's relationship with his own judgment. It does not simply introduce doubt in the way that failure introduces doubt, not the clean, instructive doubt of a mistake made with good information. Betrayal introduces a retroactive doubt, a doubt that reaches backward through time and contaminates every decision that was made in the presence of the person who betrayed it. Darius rode east and felt this contamination running through his memory of the past 72 hours, finding Sarath's fingerprints on things he had not thought to examine. The evacuation order. Efficiently executed. Of course it had been efficiently executed. Sarath had needed the population moved, needed the capital cleared, needed the perimeter established that put Darius and the garrison in the Highland camp and left the eastern ridge outside the area of concentrated attention. The efficiency had not been loyalty. It had been preparation. What Darius found himself confronting, riding east at the fastest pace the second horse could sustain, was not simply the operational problem of Sarath and 12 men moving toward Elyra on the eastern ridge. It was the deeper problem, the one that powered the operational problem and gave it its particular cruelty. He had spent 15 years building an institution whose entire logic was based on the premise that sufficient power, properly organized, produced loyalty. That people served him because the cost of not serving him was higher than the cost of service. That the architecture of fear and reward he had constructed was stable because it was rational, because the calculation always came out in favor of compliance. He had believed this. He had built his kingdom on it. He had never seriously questioned it. What he was riding through was the answer to a question he had never thought to ask. What happens to that architecture when the thing that holds it together, the power itself, begins to come apart? What happens to loyalty that was always really calculation when the math changes? You find out what the calculation always was. You find out that what you called loyalty was always just a different kind of self-interest wearing loyalty's face. He had built an empire of men who followed him because it was profitable. The moment it stopped being profitable, they found new math. This was not surprising. The fact that it was not surprising that some cold and honest part of him had always known this was what he had built, was the thing that had actual weight to it, had always known it and built it anyway, because the alternative was the thing he had been trained from boyhood to believe was impossible, an empire built on something other than fear and calculation. An empire built on something that required people to be genuinely chosen rather than coerced into choosing correctly. He had never believed that was possible. He was riding toward the specific person who might be the first evidence that it was. The ridge came up at mid-morning, and he heard Sarath before he saw him. The voice of his former lieutenant carrying through the dry Highland air with the quality of a man who is managing a situation that has not gone exactly as planned, controlled but edged, the particular register of someone performing confidence over uncertainty. Darius dismounted silently and moved forward on foot, using the scrub growth along the ridge approach for cover with the practiced ease of a man who had not spent all his years behind a throne. Old skills. Older than the throne. He moved fast and quiet and reached the ridge's edge in time to see the full picture of what he was moving into. Sarath stood 15 feet from Elyra, 12 men were arrayed behind him in the loose formation of soldiers who were present as demonstration rather than active force, a show of numbers rather than an attack formation. The message was not, "We will hurt you." The message was, "You do not have a choice here." Elyra stood where Darius had left her. The silver eyes were on Serath, with the complete steady attention that she brought to everything, and she had not moved from the spot. She did not look like a woman being compelled. She looked like a woman who was deciding, which was the most dangerous possible thing from Serath's perspective, and the most important possible thing from every other perspective. "I'm telling you the situation clearly," Serath was saying. His voice had the specific flatness of a man reciting a position he had prepared. "The king has lost control of this. The coalition is advancing. There is no political authority left in Ravarin that can protect you. What I'm offering is a framework that keeps you alive and stops the destruction without requiring what?" Elyra's voice. Darius went still at the ridge edge and let it reach him. "Without requiring you to rely on someone who has already proven what he values and what he doesn't." A silence. Serath's voice was not without intelligence. He had framed it precisely. He had aimed it at the exact thing. The still raw fact of what Darius had done to her. The public severing, the formal humiliation, the words in the great hall. He had found the wound and was pressing on it with the specific skill of a man who had spent years watching his king and learning where the leverage points were on everyone around him. "The Keldrath scholars can contain the curse," Serath continued. "They have studied the moonbound bloodline for years. They have a mechanism for resealing the breach without requiring forgiveness from—" He paused. "Without requiring anything from you that isn't simply an act of will." "There is no mechanism," Elyra said. "Their scholars believe—" "There is no mechanism," she said again, and the repetition was not louder, but it was denser, packed with a completeness of knowledge that came from somewhere much older than scholarship. "What they have studied is the exterior of something they cannot access. They have read about the lock without ever touching it. I am the lock. I know what opens it and what doesn't, and it is not their mechanism." Serath's jaw tightened. The prepared position was running into resistance he had not fully accounted for. Darius watched from the ridge edge and recognized the specific moment when a man's plan encounters a human being who refuses to behave like a variable in the plan's equation. "Then you're choosing to let it continue," Serath said. The flatness was breaking up. Underneath it, something more honest and more dangerous. The frustration of a man who had believed he was making a rational trade and was discovering the other party in the trade was not interested in his rationality. "Villages are gone. Thousands of people displaced. You have the capacity to stop it, and you're standing here making choices about the man who—" "Don't," she said. The word was small, and it ended the sentence absolutely. Serath stopped. In the silence, Darius stepped out from the scrub cover and onto the ridge. The 12 men saw him before Serath did. He watched the shift in their attention, the precise recalibration of 12 bodies registering unexpected input, hands moving in the direction of weapons, the automatic response of soldiers whose training operated faster than their judgment. He walked forward with the specific quality of movement that he had never entirely learned from anyone, but had simply developed through years of being in rooms where he was the most dangerous person present, not aggressive, not careful, but simply inevitable. The particular walk of a man who does not require anyone's permission to be where he is. Serath turned. Darius watched the face of his former lieutenant perform several calculations in rapid succession. Surprise, which resolved into assessment, which resolved into the specific kind of composure that a man reaches for when he knows the situation has shifted but has not yet determined how far. The composure of someone buying time. "My king," Serath said. "Don't," Darius said, using Elyra's word without intending to, and felt the echo of it as he said it. The 12 men had not moved. They were watching the Keldrath commandant scenario play out in their heads. 12 against 1, those numbers work. But the arithmetic of numbers only held in situations where the one in question was operating by the same rules as the 12. Darius had not operated by those rules for 15 years, and every man standing on that ridge who had served under him knew it. He stopped 6 feet from Serath. He looked at the man he had trusted with his personal security, his communications, his proximity to every decision that mattered for the better part of a decade, and felt the contaminated retrospection running back through all of it and finding, in the altered light of this morning, the places where it had always been calculation. "You've been in contact with Keldrath for how long?" he said. Sarath held his gaze. He had decided on composure, and he was maintaining it with the effort of a man who knows composure is his best remaining option. Long enough to know that what was coming was not manageable from inside the kingdom's political framework. Long enough to build an alternative. "While you served me. While I did what I calculated was in the best interest of the people under Ravarin's protection." Ishbats Mopatin. Sarath's voice carried a quality that Darius recognized as something genuinely believed rather than performed. This was the unsettling thing. The man was not lying about his motivation. He had done this because he had looked at the trajectory of events and made a calculation, and the calculation had told him that the existing structure was not going to hold, and he needed to position himself inside a structure that would. "You were compromised," Sarath said, "from the moment you brought her out of Aldenmere. I watched it. I tried to... The council's position was the right position. You chose differently." "I chose differently," Darius said, "and now the kingdom is gone." "The kingdom was built on a massacre," Darius said, "and you knew that too. Everyone in that archive knew that. You chose to be loyal to the structure rather than to the truth underneath it, and when the structure started to fail, you went looking for a new structure. That's not principle, Sarath. That's just a more sophisticated version of the same calculation you've always made." Something moved through Sarath's face. Not collapse. He was too controlled for collapse, but the specific flinch of a man who has been described accurately rather than attacked. "What would you have done differently?" Sarath said. "In my position, looking at what was happening." It was a genuine question. That was the worst part. Underneath the betrayal, underneath the Keldrath arrangement and the 12 men and the plan to deliver Elyra to foreign scholars who would treat her as a mechanism, underneath all of it, there was a man who believed he was asking a reasonable question about what reasonable men do when structures fail. "I would have come to me," Darius said. "You were not in a position to..." "I would have come to me anyway," Darius said. "That's the part you never understood. Not about loyalty. About the thing underneath loyalty that makes it worth anything. The willingness to deliver truth to power even when power doesn't want it. You had information about Keldrath's approach for how long? And you managed it privately rather than bringing it to me, because bringing it to me would have required you to trust that I could handle it, and you had already decided I couldn't." He paused. "When did you decide that?" Sarath's jaw worked. "The garden," he said finally. 3 days ago. When I tracked her to the ridge and watched you ride out to meet her alone. Without formation, without strategy, without a plan. That's when I knew." "That's when you knew what?" "That you were going to make the same choice again," Sarath said. "The soft choice. That she had gotten into something in you that was not compatible with what the kingdom required." The morning light lay flat across the ridge. Darius stood in it and understood something that he had been circling for 3 days and had not yet directly faced. The thing that Sarath had seen in the garden, the quality that had looked to his lieutenant like softness and poor judgment, was the specific thing that was the only possible way through the situation in front of him, and that the reason his 12 best men had followed Sarath east this morning while Holt held the settlement was that Sarath's version of the world, power organized around calculation, loyalty as a subset of self-interest, everything reducible to leverage, was a version of the world they all recognized and trusted because it was the world Darius had built. And a man's own creation is the hardest thing in that creation to indict. He had built men in his own image, and his own image, until 3 days ago, would have done exactly what Sarath did. "Step back," Darius said. My king, you are not my officer anymore. You removed yourself from that position when you opened a private channel with a foreign military command. Step back from this woman and take your men off this ridge." Sarath looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the 12 men. He looked at Elyra. He performed the calculation that a man in his position performs, the one where he assesses whether the authority he is being commanded by still has enough structural support to compel compliance, or whether the balance has shifted far enough that compliance is now the wrong calculation. "You have nothing left to enforce that with," Sarath said quietly. It was not said with satisfaction. It was said with the bleak precision of a true statement, and it was, in the structural sense, accurate. He had no garrison, no crown, no fortress. He was standing on a ridge with no force behind him, and the Keldrath advanced 6 hours north in a betrayed command structure and a kingdom that was in the process of ceasing to have occurred. By every metric that Ravaran had operated on for 15 years, Sarath was right. Darius heard Elyra move before he saw it. The sound of her feet on the ridgestone, deliberate and unhurried, moving in a direction he could not immediately track because his eyes were on Sarath. He turned. She had walked to a position that placed her beside him rather than behind him. She stood at his left, 3 feet away, facing the 12 men and Sarath, with those silver eyes that were still luminous in the way they had been on the ridge the morning before, the fully open quality, the depth that had no visible bottom. She looked at Sarath. "He has something you don't," she said. Her voice was rough with disuse still, each sentence carrying the texture of something emerging from a long sealed place. "You want to call it softness, but it's not that." Sarath looked at her. His expression carried the professional wariness of a man reassessing a variable he had undervalued. "What is it then?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Accountability," she said. "He knows what he did. He came here knowing that knowing it may not be enough. He came here without a plan because there is no plan that works here. There is only a person and a choice, and what it costs both of them to make it." She looked at Sarath with the eyes that had been reading Darius for 8 months, and were now turned on his former lieutenant with the same complete attention. "You have a plan, a structure, a calculation. You will always have those things, and you will always be standing exactly where you're standing right now, in front of a choice that your plan cannot account for, trying to reduce it to numbers." The ridge was very quiet. Then one of the 12 men stepped back. Just one, a small movement, half a foot, no more, but visible. And then another. Not a collapse of the formation, not a dramatic abandonment, but the specific small recalibration of men who have been watching a situation and revising their assessment, who have heard something that does not fit in the architecture of what they were brought here to enforce, and are making the micro-adjustments of people who are beginning to doubt the structure they are standing in. Sarath saw it. His face changed, not into anger, into something colder and more honest, the face of a man who has just watched the calculation he has been maintaining become actively unreliable. The specific face of someone at the exact moment they realize the number they were certain of is wrong. "This changes nothing operationally," Sarath said. The voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him something now. "The coalition is still—" "I know," Darius said. "You have no leverage with them, no position, nothing to offer that—" "I know." "Then what exactly is your plan?" Sarath said, and beneath the tactical question, naked and real for the first time in this conversation, was the thing that had been driving the calculation all along, the fear. Not of the coalition, not of the curse. The fear of a man who has based his entire sense of safety on the reliability of power structures, who has discovered that the structures are failing, and who has no framework for what comes after. Darius looked at his former lieutenant and recognized the fear because he had been living in a version of it for 15 years and had only recently started to understand what it was. "I don't have a plan," Darius said. "I have a person, and a choice that's hers to make. And whatever comes after that, we face without the structure, because the structure is what started all of this." Sarath stared at him. For a long moment, the ridge held the specific suspension of a situation that has not yet resolved. All the forces present, none of them yet in motion, the air between the people on it carrying the weight of what comes next. Then Sarath made a decision. He stepped back. Then he turned and walked to his horse, and the 12 men followed him, not with the air of men who had been defeated, but with the specific, unresolved quiet of men who have witnessed something they did not have a category for and have decided to carry it away from the immediate situation and examine it somewhere else. They rode north, toward the Highland settlement, toward Holt, who would deal with them, toward a situation that was not resolved but was, at least, suspended. Darius and Elyra stood on the ridge alone. The eastern horizon was entirely still. Behind them, somewhere north, the Keldrath advance was continuing its 6-hour calculation toward a kingdom that was no longer fully there to receive it. The ground under their feet was Ravaran's oldest geography, the territory his ancestors had stood on when they made the decision that had built everything and cost everything. The original ground, the ground that remembered. She turned to him. He turned to her. The silver eyes were steady in the morning light. all the depth in them, all the century weight, all the specific luminosity of a seal that was fully open, all of it present, all of it still. But underneath it, the 20-year-old woman who had sat in a rubble-strewn courtyard and watched soldiers move through it without flinching, who had tended wounds with focused practical care, who had read him in the dark hours before dawn for 8 months and given him back something he had lost so gradually he hadn't known it was missing. She was there too. Both things at once. She had always been both things at once. He had only ever allowed himself to see one of them. She opened her mouth. And what she said was not the forgiveness he could not ask for. What she said was, "The coalition reaches the settlement in 5 hours. Yes," he said, "you have no army. No. And you're going to go meet them anyway." He looked at her. Yes. A long breath moved through her. She looked away from him, toward the north, toward the direction of 10,000 displaced people and one old general and a Keldrath advance that had decided a wounded king was close enough to a finished king to move on. "You're going to walk into their command position," she said, "alone, with nothing. With the truth," he said, "about what built this kingdom and what broke it, about what they are advancing toward and what they will find when they get there." He paused. "It probably won't be enough." "It almost certainly won't be enough," she said. "I know." She turned back to him. The silver eyes moved across his face with the complete, unhurried attention that he had spent 15 years watching skilled readers of people fail to match. She reached a decision. He saw it arrive in her face, not the big decision, not the one that lived in the sealed place behind her ribs. A smaller one, adjacent to it. The decision of someone who is not yet ready to make the primary choice but is willing to move one step toward the position from which that choice will eventually be made or refused. "Go meet them," she said. Tell them the truth, all of it." A pause. "I'll be here when you come back." It was not a promise of forgiveness. It was not a promise of anything specific. It was the statement of a person who had decided that whatever came next should not be decided in the absence of all the available information. That the information available from watching a king with nothing walk into an impossible situation and tell the truth, that information was relevant to the choice she was carrying. Darius held her eyes for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward his horse. 10 feet from it, he stopped. He turned back. "Elyra." She looked at him. "Whatever you decide," he said. "The kingdom, the curse, whatever you decide, it will have been the right decision. Not because I agree with it, because it's yours." She said nothing. He rode north. Behind him, the eastern ridge held a woman with silver eyes and an open seal and a choice that was genuinely hers, and the vast, patient architecture of a grief older than the kingdom that had caused it, waiting with the specific quality of something that has waited long enough to know that a few more hours cost nothing. But in the distant north, already visible from the highland's edge when Darius arrived breathless and alone, the Keldrath banners had come over the ridgeline. Not 6 hours. 3. They had moved faster than the sound predicted, and in the highland settlement, Holt was waiting with his face carrying the expression it had carried on every morning before a battle that was going to go badly. The face of a man who has done the calculations and knows the numbers and is choosing to stand anyway. 3 hours. No army. No plan. And somewhere east, a woman deciding whether a man who had broken her was worth the cost of what fixing him would require. This was the moment everything that Darius Thornheart had ever called strength was going to be revealed as the specific, insufficient thing it had always been. And the only replacement for it had not yet been chosen. The Keldrath banners came over the highland ridge in 3 columns. Not the loose advance formation of a force testing terrain, not the exploratory spread of scouts ahead of a main body. 3 tight columns, organized, moving with the compressed efficiency of an army that had already decided the engagement was won and was proceeding to the administrative phase of that conclusion. An army that had looked at the intelligence it possessed, a kingdom in active dissolution, a displaced population with no defensive position, a king with no garrison, and determined that what remained between it and its objective was logistics rather than resistance. They were not wrong about the numbers. They were wrong about the man. Darius stood at the northern edge of the highland settlement with Holt on his left and the settlement's noise behind him. 10,000 people moving through the controlled urgency of a camp that had just received visual confirmation of the threat that had been abstract until now. The particular compressed fear sound of a large group of humans processing danger without a clear outlet for it. He stood in front of all of that with his arms loose at his sides and watched the 3 columns descend the Highland Ridge and thought about what he had available to him. No garrison in formation. The evacuation had fragmented the command structure, and Sarath's departure with 12 senior men had stripped out the experienced corps. What remained was perhaps 200 fighters, mixed garrison remnants and some of the more capable men from the outer settlement populations who had organized themselves into a loose defensive posture around the settlement's perimeter with the improvised discipline of people who understood what was required but lacked the trained coherence to execute it at the level the situation demanded. 200 against the 3 columns descending the ridge, which his estimation put it somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000. The math was not the kind of math that produced comfort. "Tell me you have something," Holt said, not looking at him, eyes on the columns. "I have the truth," Darius said. A pause. "I have heard you say that twice in the past hour, and I am still waiting for it to constitute a tactical position." "The Keldrath Commandant," Darius said. "Ferris. Where is he?" "Still in the camp. I had him held after you left." Holt's jaw worked. "He is not happy about it." "Good. Unhappy men are easier to read." Darius turned from the ridge. "Bring him, and I need Sarath." Holt looked at him. "Sarath?" "Yes?" "The man who spent the past 12 hours building a private arrangement with the force currently descending our ridge." "He has context I need," Darius said. "And I need him to hear what I'm going to say to Ferris, because when this is done, one way or another, what Sarath decides to do next will determine a great deal about what comes after today." He met Holt's eyes. "He is not my enemy. He is a man who made a calculation that the existing structure was failing and positioned himself for what he thought came after. That's not evil. It's a failure of imagination." He paused. "I've been the same failure. I understand it from the inside." Holt looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has followed a particular king through enough impossible mornings to have developed a sense for which ones were going to resolve and which ones were going to cost everything. "Right," Holt said, and went to get the commandant and the traitor. The thing about standing in front of a situation with no structural power is that it strips the performance away. This was something Darius was discovering in real time, and the discovery had the specific quality of things learned late, the acute awareness of how long you have been operating without the lesson. For 15 years he had walked into rooms carrying the weight of everything behind him: the garrison, the fortress, the treasury, the treaty network, the accumulated political force of a kingdom that had not lost a military engagement in a generation. He had believed, sincerely and without much examination, that his own authority was the source of his effectiveness in those rooms, that what made other people listen when he spoke was something inherent to him. What he was understanding now, standing on Highland dirt with 200 improvised fighters and 3 Keldrath columns descending toward him, was that what made people listen had never been him. It had been the structure, and the structure was gone, and what was left was simply a man, flawed, late to most of the important understandings of his life, carrying the specific damage of a person who has spent 15 years in a role designed to prevent genuine self-examination. A man who had stood on a ridge and told a woman who had every right to refuse him that the decision was hers and meant it. That was all he had. That was what he was going to walk forward with. Ferris arrived with Holt and 2 guards, carrying himself with the tight composure of a man who has been held against his professional objections and is managing the indignity with the deliberate restraint of someone who knows the situation may still resolve in his favor. He assessed the columns on the ridge without looking at them and brought his eyes to Darius with the specific attention of a man recalculating. Sarath arrived separately on foot without the 12 men. He stood apart from Ferris by 10 feet and looked at Darius with an expression that had been reorganized since the ridge, not into guilt, not into submission, but into something that was possibly the beginning of the honest uncertainty that comes after a man's calculation has been publicly insufficient. Darius looked at both of them and started talking. He did not organize it. He did not prepare it. There was no architecture to what came out of him in the next 10 minutes. No strategic framing, no negotiating position, no effort to control what information he revealed and what he withheld in the service of leverage. He simply told the truth, in order, completely, the way you tell it when you have nothing left to protect. He told them about the moonbound bloodline and the founding massacre that built Rovarian. He told them what the curse was and how it operated. He told them what Elyra was and what had been sealed in her and what his choice in the Great Hall had broken. He told them what she had told him on the ridge, that the mechanism could not be stopped, only redirected, and only through a choice that was entirely hers and could not be compelled, extracted, or produced by Keldrath scholars with a containment mechanism. He told them that every village and province and geographic feature that had disappeared from Ravaran in the past 72 hours was not coming back. He told them that the capital was gone. He told them that what the 3 columns descending the ridge were marching toward was not a wounded kingdom that could be claimed. It was the residue of a crime committed centuries ago that was in the process of settling its own account. He told them that if the Keldrath coalition took the surviving population of Ravaran into its custody, if it treated the 10,000 people in this highland settlement as the spoils of an advance on a dissolved kingdom, it would be making the same category of choice that Ravaran's founders had made, and that the universe, or history, or the specific mechanism of consequence that had been designed into this territory's bones had demonstrated an opinion about that category of choice. He stopped. Ferris was very still. Sarath was looking at a point approximately 3 feet in front of his own boots with the expression of a man doing difficult arithmetic. "You are asking me," Ferris said carefully, "to halt a coalition advance on the basis of a story about an ancient bloodline curse. I am telling you what is true," Darius said. "What you do with it is yours. The coalition's objective in this advance is gone," Darius said. "Whatever the coalition's objective was, it existed in a kingdom that is no longer fully here. The territory you have been marching toward is in the process of returning to what it was before my ancestors claimed it. You are advancing on a ghost." Ferris was quiet for a moment. "The population," he said. "The population is not Ravaran," Darius said. "The population is people. They are not the kingdom. They are not a resource. They are people who have been displaced by the consequence of a wrong that was committed centuries before they were born and that they have no responsibility for." His voice stayed level. "If the coalition treats them as a resource, if it takes them, holds them, uses them as leverage, it will have advanced on a dissolving kingdom and come away with only the people. And the people will remember how they were taken, and that memory will outlast whatever structure the coalition builds on this ground." He held Ferris's eyes. "I have spent 15 years building an empire on the logic of force. I am standing in front of you as the evidence of what that logic produces. I would think carefully before choosing the same logic for a different structure." Ferris looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the settlement behind Darius. The 10,000 faces, the improvised camp, the compressed fear sound of people waiting to find out what their value was to the force coming down the ridge. Then he looked at the columns, still descending, still organized, still operating on orders that had been given before this conversation. "I need to communicate with the advance command," Ferris said. "Then do that," Darius said. Ferris turned to one of his aides. Darius heard the low, fast exchange of instructions. A rider broke from the settlement's edge at speed, moving toward the columns with the flag configuration that meant halt and hold position. Darius turned to Sarath. Sarath had looked up from the point 3 feet in front of his boots. "I need to know something," Darius said. He kept his voice completely flat. Not cold, not confrontational. Flat. In the way a genuine question is flat, stripped of the performance of whatever emotion surrounds it. "When you opened the channel with Keldrath, when you built the arrangement, what did you tell yourself you were protecting?" Sarath looked at him. "The people," he said, "Ravaran's people. When the kingdom started to fail, someone needed to position for what came after. Someone needed to ensure that the population had a structure to land in. And you decided that was you," Darius said. "You weren't making the decision," Sarath said. The words came out with more heat than he had been carrying before, something breaking through the composure, something genuine and raw underneath it. "You were on a ridge with a woman who had every reason to let everything burn. You were—" He stopped. started again. You were operating from a completely different set of priorities than the 10,000 people in that settlement. Yes, Darius said. I was. Sarath blinked. I was operating from the only set of priorities that could actually affect the outcome, Darius said, which was hers, not mine, not yours, not Keldrath's. Hers. He looked at his former lieutenant with the complete, direct eye contact that had always been his primary tool of communication with people he needed to actually reach rather than simply command. She has a choice. It is genuinely hers. It cannot be extracted by force or structured around by scholarship. The only variable that affects whether she makes it in the direction of stopping this is whether she believes there is something worth stopping it for. He paused. I am the evidence she is evaluating. If I had stayed on the ridge trying to manage her toward the right decision, that evidence would have been useless. I had to go be it somewhere else where she could watch it happen. The silence between the two men was different from the silences that had preceded it. Sarath looked at the settlement. He looked at the columns, still halted on the ridge slope, the halt flag having reached the advanced scouts, and propagated back through the formation in the particular ripple of a large body receiving unexpected instructions. He looked back at Darius. The 12 men I brought to the ridge, he said. They're in the settlement. They haven't done anything further. After what happened on the ridge, he stopped. They're yours if you want them. Darius nodded. It was not forgiveness, it was not restoration. It was the simple acknowledgement of an offering that was real and was accepted as real, without the ceremonial structure that would have made it feel cleaner than it was. Things were not clean. They were what they were. The rider came back from the Keldrath column with a return flag that Ferris read and turned from with the expression of a man who has received information that has moved the situation into a territory his original orders did not map. The advance command wants a direct communication with you, Ferris said to Darius. In person, their position, on the ridge. He looked at the Highland settlement. In exchange, the advance holds at current position. That's not a negotiating position, Holt said from behind Darius's shoulder. That's an invitation to walk into their command structure without protection. Yes, Darius said. They could simply hold you, use you as leverage. They could, Darius said. But Ferris has heard the information I have about the curse, and Ferris has to communicate that information to his command, which means his command is now aware that whatever leverage I represent is considerably complicated by the fact that the thing they are advancing on is not a normal territorial acquisition. He looked at Holt. A king who has no kingdom and no army and nothing worth taking is not useful leverage. He is simply a nuisance. You are betting your life on that assessment, Holt said. I'm betting what's left of Ravarin's people on it, Darius said, which is the appropriate bet to make. He looked at the camp behind him. The 10,000 people, the fear sound, the compressed waiting of a displaced population standing at the edge of what came after the kingdom they had known. Then he looked north at the ridge, and the 3 columns holding on its slope, and whatever waited in the command position at the top. Hold the settlement, he said to Holt. Whatever happens on that ridge, your job is to keep those people calm and in position. Don't let them scatter. Don't let the garrison improvise. If I come back with something useful. If I don't, he stopped. If you don't, Holt said, I'll do what can be done with what we have. You always have, Darius said. He walked to his horse and rode toward the Keldrath position on the ridge. The advance command had established itself at the ridge's highest point, with the practiced efficiency of a campaign-hardened military structure. Not a permanent installation, but the organized temporary authority of a force that had done this before. The kind of setup that said, we are not rushing this, and we are not afraid of the time it takes. 3 officers waited for him. The senior of the 3 was a woman. Darius assessed this in the half-second he had before the full picture resolved, filed it, and let it recede into the background information of the scene. He did not adjust anything about his approach based on it, because adjusting would have been both insulting and tactically stupid, and he had learned to be neither of those things in the presence of someone he needed to actually communicate with. She was perhaps 50, solid, weathered, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been in enough dangerous situations to have stopped wasting energy on its performance. The Keldrath insignia at her chest was the highest rank he had seen on anyone in their force. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who has read many men and has long since stopped being surprised by what she finds. "Thornheart," she said. "Marshal," he said, reading her insignia correctly. "Lena Voss," she said. "Coalition Unified Command." She looked at the horse he had ridden up alone, at his empty hands, at the absence of any guard formation behind him. "Ferris told me you came to our camp this morning with a story." "I came with the truth," Darius said. "There's a distinction there that I'm sure matters to you," Voss said. "Sit down." He sat across from her at the field table. Two of her officers positioned themselves flanking, not threateningly, the standard reading the room positions of people whose job was to pay attention. "The curse," Voss said. "Yes." "The moonbound bloodline." "Yes." "The last heir." She looked at him with the flat assessment of a woman who has processed a great deal of information in the past hour, and is now in the phase of determining which pieces of it are real and which pieces are the kind of story a man tells when he has nothing else to offer. "Where is she?" "East Ridge," Darius said, "above where the Moran Basin was." "Was," Voss said. "Is no longer there," Darius said. Voss's jaw moved slightly, the tell of a person encountering information that does not fit in the available categories. "Ferris's report," she said, "mentioned specific geographic absences, features that are no longer where the survey maps show them." She placed both hands flat on the table. "I sent my own scouts to verify before I requested this meeting. 3 of them." A pause. "2 came back. They described what you described. The 3rd, she stopped. "The 3rd was in the radius when a feature disappeared," Darius said quietly. Voss looked at him. "Yes," she said. The weight of that single syllable landed between them. A Keldrath scout had been inside the radius when a piece of geography ceased to exist, which meant the Coalition now had something that no briefing document and no strategic analysis and no amount of Ferris's careful communication could fully produce: direct, physical, irreversible evidence that the situation on the ground was not a political situation, not a territorial situation. Something else. Something that the military frameworks they had brought to this advance were not designed to address. "What are you here to tell me?" Voss said. "That the advance serves no purpose," Darius said. "The Coalition's objective was a territorial acquisition that no longer exists. What remains is a population of 10,000 people who have been displaced from a kingdom that is in the process of ceasing to have been." He held her eyes. "Those people are not Ravaran anymore. Ravaran is ending. They are people. And what the Coalition does with people who are not a territorial objective will be the first decision it makes about what it is, rather than what it wants." Voss looked at him. "You're asking me to halt a full campaign advance on the basis of what your own scouts confirmed," Darius said. A silence. "What is the status of the woman on the ridge?" Voss said. "She has a choice," Darius said. "It is hers. It cannot be compelled." "If she makes the wrong choice, then the dissolution continues," Darius said. "The outer provinces begin to disappear, and the Coalition's advance will be moving through territory that is actively in the process of returning to what it was before anyone claimed it. Your men will be marching through a geography that is forgetting they exist." He paused. "The scout who didn't come back. Your men know that. They are sitting on that ridge right now, knowing that." Voss's face was very still. She looked at the map on the table between them, the survey map of Ravaran's territory, its provinces and settlements and geographic features marked with the precision of a campaign planning document. She looked at it for a long moment, with the eyes of a commander who is performing a specific and difficult calculation. The calculation of a person in authority who has received information that is incompatible with the orders she is operating under, and must determine whether the authority of those orders or the evidence of her own scouts and her own judgment takes precedence. This was the hardest calculation in any military structure. It was the one that ended careers or defined them, depending on which side of history the decision ultimately fell on. Darius did not push. He had delivered what he had. The delivery was done. What happened next was in Voss's hands and her officers' hands, and the 200 men down the slope who had sat with the absence of their missing colleague and the specific cold knowledge of what that absence meant. Voss looked up from the map. "The advance halts," she said. One of her officers opened his mouth. "The advance halts," she said again, and the repetition was the version that carried the full weight of the rank behind it, and the officer closed his mouth. She looked at Darius. "I am not withdrawing," she said. "I'm halting and reassessing. The coalition's position is that the situation on the ground has changed materially from what the advance was planned around, and a halt is the operationally correct response to material change." She looked at him steadily. "That is not a concession. That is good military practice." "I understand," Darius said. "The woman on the ridge has how long?" Voss said. "I don't know," Darius said honestly. "The dissolution has been accelerating. The outer provinces." "How long?" she said again. He calculated. "Hours," he said, "not days." Voss nodded once. The nod of a woman who has made the primary decision and is now moving into the operational details of executing it with the minimal additional damage. "Then we don't have the luxury of extended political conversations," she said. "Go back. Do what you can do. I will hold the advance for 12 hours. After that, my orders and my structure and my obligations to the coalition take precedence over the situation as I currently understand it." She looked at him with the flat, steady eyes. "That's what I can give you. 12 hours. Darius looked at the woman across the table and felt, briefly and without letting it affect his face, the particular gratitude of a man who has received something genuine from someone who had no obligation to give it. Not a gift. A calculated risk made by a commander who was putting her professional judgment on the line for an assessment that could be wrong. That was its own kind of honesty. "Thank you," he said. He rode back down the ridge at a controlled pace, not the dead gallop of urgency, but the deliberate speed of a man who needed to think between here and the settlement, who needed to use the 10 minutes of distance for something useful. What he had was 12 hours and a halt that was not a withdrawal. What he needed was the thing he had never needed before in 15 years of ruling. Not leverage, not force, not the architecture of a deal. He needed a woman on a ridge to make a choice she had every right to refuse. He could not produce that. He had always been able to produce outcomes. He had structured situations, applied pressure, arranged incentives, removed obstacles, built the conditions that made certain results more likely than others. He had never in his life been in the position of having done everything available to him and arrived at a moment that simply required someone else to choose. The helplessness of it was profound and specific. It was, he thought, probably the most honest position he had ever occupied. He reached the settlement and found Holt immediately. Holt, who had been watching the ridge with the binocular assessment of a man who had been calculating outcomes for 40 years and knew that the absence of immediate violence was information but not reassurance. 12 hours, Darius said. Holt received this. And then we find out whether a woman's choice or a coalition's orders has more force. Holt was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Go east, Darius said. You already did that. I'm going again. He met Holt's eyes, not to convince her, not to produce an outcome. I told her I'd come back when it was done. It's done. I'm coming back. He paused. She needs to see the result before she decides. Not because I'm managing the information, because the truth of what's happened is part of what she's weighing, and she deserves to have all of it. Holt looked at him for a long moment. You're a different person than you were 4 days ago, he said. Not with approval or disapproval, with the specific observation of a man who has spent enough time with someone to mark the before and after clearly. Yes, Darius said. I'm not sure yet if that's what saves us or what costs us everything. Neither am I, Darius said, but it's what's true. He rode east. The landscape he moved through was continuing to change, not dramatically, not in the theatrical way of something designed to be witnessed, in the quiet, accumulative way of a process that had been patient for centuries and was not interested in spectacle. A tree line that had been present on the morning ride was simply no longer there, replaced by the bare continuity of ground that had decided it did not remember what had stood on it. A ridge feature that had been a navigating landmark was smoothed to nothing. The kingdom was returning to itself. He tried to feel the loss of it the way he expected to feel it. The 15 years, the campaigns, the architecture of an empire built from will and discipline and a willingness to pay whatever the throne demanded. He waited for the grief of that to arrive and be the appropriate size. What arrived instead was something quieter and more honest. Not grief, a kind of relief that he did not entirely understand. As if the structures that were disappearing had been heavy in ways he had trained himself not to notice, and their removal was uncovering a surface that had always been underneath them and was now, for the first time, getting air. The ridge came up in the early afternoon light. She was still there. She was sitting now rather than standing, on the bare ground at the ridge's edge, her legs folded, her back straight, facing east with the specific posture of someone who has been in sustained internal examination for hours and has settled into it rather than fighting it. The silver eyes were open and looking at the eastern horizon, which was still intact. The outer territories, the borders of what Ravarin had claimed most recently, still present because the curse was moving outward from its origin and had not yet reached that far. He dismounted and walked to her and sat down on the ground beside her without being invited, without asking, without the architecture of approach. He simply sat beside her the way she had sat beside him through the dark hours for 8 months, and looked at the same horizon she was looking at. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "The advance halted," he said finally. 12 hours. "I heard the riders," she said. "I told them the truth," he said. "All of it. About what Ravarin was built on. About what you are. About the choice." He paused. "The Marshal is a reasonable person. She made a decision based on what her own scouts confirmed." Elyra was quiet. "And Serath," she said. "He gave me back the men," Darius said. "He heard the truth, and he gave me back the men." She turned her head and looked at him. The silver eyes were steady and full of that depth that had become something larger since the seal cracked open. Not threatening, not enormous in the way of something bearing down, but enormous in the way of something that extends in all directions and has no visible limit. "You went and did that," she said. "Alone. With nothing." "Yes." "Why?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He thought about it. He owed her a genuine answer and not a performed one, and the genuine answer required him to locate it honestly. "Because it was the only thing I had left that was mine," he said. "Not the thrones, not the structures, mine. The ability to stand in front of people who have every advantage over me and tell them the truth and accept whatever they do with it." He looked at the horizon. "It's the only thing I've done in 15 years that I'm not ashamed of." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was moving across the ridge. In the west, over the territory that had been the heart of Ravarin, the sky was doing something unusual, not darkening toward storm, but lightening, as if the removal of what had been built there was uncovering something underneath the sky's surface, some quality of light that the weight of empire had been blocking. "It's getting faster," she said. He looked west. She was right. The quality of dissolution was different now. Not the slow, deliberate rhythm of the first days, the patient expansion of something with centuries of patience behind it. Something had changed in the past hours. The process was accelerating, tightening toward the center, the outer territories beginning to pull inward. "The capital's location," Elyra said. Her voice was very quiet. "What was under the capital? That's the origin point. Once the dissolution reaches it, what happens?" he said. "The debt finishes," she said. "Whatever remains in the radius at that moment." She stopped. "The settlement. The 12 hours doesn't matter. If the origin point is reached before I decide, how long?" he said. She closed her eyes and felt something he couldn't see. Felt it with the internal awareness of a person who was carrying the mechanism in her own body and could read its progress the way he could read a battle by sound. 2 hours, she said. Maybe less. 2 hours. He sat with it. He did not calculate. He did not structure. He sat on the ridge beside her and let the 2 hours be what it was. The specific, finite weight of time that is genuinely running out, not as a concept or a strategic variable, but as a physical reality pressing on the present moment. "Elyra," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't ask me. Don't manage it. Whatever you're about to say, I'm not asking you anything," he said. She looked at him. "I am sitting here," he said. "That's all. I'm sitting here because I said I'd come back, and I came back, and because there is nowhere else I want to be in the next 2 hours, regardless of what they produce." He met her eyes. "That's not strategy. That's not management. That's just what's true." Something moved across the silver eyes. He watched it move. He had spent 8 months learning to read the language of her face, and what moved across it now was not something from that language. It was something new, something that belonged to the person she was becoming in this moment, rather than the person she had been in all the moments before. Something that had the quality, the very fragile and non-guaranteed and genuinely uncertain quality, of a decision beginning to form. In the West, in the territory where Ravarin had been, the dissolution was visible now, with the naked eye. A slow alteration at the horizon, the landscape revising itself, the accumulated weight of centuries of claimed land returning to whatever it had been before the claiming. In the east, the outer territories were still there, still intact, still holding the shape they had held before any of this began. The origin point was somewhere between those two horizons, where the capital had been, and it was 2 hours from completing the debt that had been owed for centuries before either of them were born. Elyra pressed her right hand flat against her chest. She felt the mechanism. She felt the door. She felt the thing on the other side of the door, the vast and patient grief that had been the architecture of her family's purpose for longer than she had language for. And in the sealed space inside it, at the deepest point, she felt something she had not expected to find there. Not hatred, not the clean, justified fury of a bloodline destroyed, something older than fury and more honest than hatred, the thing that lives at the center of all grief once you strip away everything that is not simply the bare fact of it. Loss. Plain and real and unperformed. The loss of people who had loved a piece of ground and been removed from it. The loss of a woman sitting in a stone garden being told she was a mistake by a man who was afraid. The loss of a voice that had been sealed for 20 years and was only just learning what it had been carrying. 2 losses. The same shape. She pressed her hand harder over her chest and felt the door and the grief and the decision that was genuinely hers and had always been genuinely hers, even when she had been told otherwise. She looked at the man sitting beside her on the ridge. He was not looking at her. He was looking west, at the horizon, at the place where his empire used to be, and his face was the face of someone who has let something go and is still in the middle of discovering what that feels like. Not peaceful, not resolved, present. Simply present, in the moment, with whatever the moment contained. She opened her mouth, and the ground shook. Both of them felt it, not the percussion of the Keldrath advance, not the geological tremor of the dissolution. Something different, something deeper and more final, rising from the specific point in the west where the origin had been, where the capital had been, where the founding murder had happened centuries ago. The origin point was reaching completion. Not 2 hours. Now. Darius turned from the horizon to her face. Elyra looked at him with the silver eyes and the open seal and the decision that was forming and not yet fully formed. And in the 2 seconds of stillness before the ground shook again, harder this time, the kind of shaking that had geological weight behind it, the earth itself asserting the finality of what was being settled. She understood that the next breath she took was going to be the breath in which she either made the choice or didn't, and that there was no version of not deciding that was also a decision, and that the man beside her had stopped being the man who had broken her at some point in the past 72 hours, and had become something she did not yet have a name for. The ground shook. The western horizon went very bright, and Elyra of the moonbound bloodline, the last heir, the vessel who had just discovered she was a person, pressed her hand over the door inside her chest, and she opened the door. Not with ceremony, not with the theatrical gesture of someone performing a decision for an audience. She opened it the way you open something that has been closed for so long that the act of opening it is almost indistinguishable from simply releasing what was already pressing against it from the inside. One small, deliberate surrender of the grip that had been maintaining the seal, a grip she had not known she was maintaining until the moment she let it go. The grief came through, not outward, not in the direction the curse had been moving, westward, territorial, consuming the geography of what had been taken. It came inward, through her, the full weight of what had lived in the sealed place rushing back into the body that had been carrying it as an absence. And the difference between carrying grief as an absence and carrying it as a presence was the difference between holding your breath and breathing. She breathed. The sound she made was not loud. It was the sound of someone whose body has been waiting a very long time to do the thing bodies are designed to do when loss finally reaches the surface. A single exhalation that contained in it everything that had been compressed into the sealed place, the grief of a bloodline, the particular grief of a 20-year-old woman sitting in a stone garden being told she was a mistake, the grief of a voice that had been locked away so long it had nearly forgotten it existed. Two griefs. Meeting. The ground stopped shaking. Darius felt it stop before he understood what the stopping meant. Felt it the way you feel a sound disappear through the sudden absence of something that had been continuous. The shaking had been building, the western horizon brightening, the origin point driving toward completion with the momentum of centuries of accumulated consequence. And then it stopped. In the specific, complete way that only deliberate action stops a physical process, not winding down, not decelerating, but halted, as if something had reached into the mechanism and closed its hand around the moving part. He turned from the horizon to her face. She was crying, not performing tears. Not the controlled, dignified version of grief that people produce when they are aware of being witnessed. Crying the way people cry when the feeling is simply larger than the container, and the container gives way, completely, without architecture, with the specific physical honesty of someone who has been holding an enormous weight for so long that the release of it removes them from the business of holding themselves together for a few seconds, while the body processes what the mind has finally allowed. He did not reach for her. He sat beside her and let it happen, and did not try to manage it or comfort it or move it toward resolution, because it was not his grief to manage, and it was not his comfort to offer, and the resolution of it was not something he could produce. He had learned this. He had learned it over the past 4 days in the brutal, specific way that lessons arrive when they arrive too late to be avoided, through the consequences of not knowing it. He sat beside her, and was present without being useful, which was the hardest thing he had done in 15 years of learning difficult things. The crying ran its course. It took several minutes, real minutes, not compressed ones. The kind of time that a feeling requires when it has been waiting as long as this one had been waiting. When she came out the other side of it, she came out changed in the way that people come out of genuine grief. Not lighter, not healed, not any of the clean metaphors that make loss sound like a process with a definite conclusion. Changed the way a landscape changes after weather. Still the same landscape, but with something rearranged at the surface. Something that had been covered now visible. Something that had been visible now revealed to have been the wrong thing to be looking at. She pressed the back of her hand against her face. A practical, unself-conscious gesture. She looked at the western horizon. The brightness that had been building was gone. The horizon was ordinary. The particular ordinary of late afternoon light on open ground. The kind of light that belongs to any day that is simply itself, rather than the day an empire finishes ending. "Is it done?" Darius said. "The dissolution stopped," she said. Her voice was rough and direct and completely without performance. "What's already gone is gone. The outer territories are still there. The people in the Highland settlement be intact," he said. She nodded. They sat with that for a moment, the specific sitting with of two people who have just come through something that cannot be summarized and are not trying to summarize it. "It wasn't forgiveness," she said. He looked at her. "Not yet," she said. "I want to be honest about that. What I did, what stopped it, was not forgiveness. It was the decision that the grief had been used long enough, that it had been the instrument of a justice that was real and that has been paid, and that I was not willing to let it keep moving beyond the point where the payment was complete." She looked at the western horizon, at the territory that was still there, the people that were still there, the geography that had been spared the final extension of the dissolution. "The capital is gone. The provinces at the core are gone. The original taking has been answered. What remains is what was not part of the original crime." "That's a precise accounting," he said. "My bloodline were precise people," she said. "They had to be. Precision was the only thing that kept the seal from breaking prematurely, from taking more than was owed." Something moved through her face. They were also human, and humans miscalculate. I think they believed, when they designed this, that there would be no person at the seal point who had the capacity to distinguish, that the grief would simply run to completion. They did not account for the possibility that the last heir might have a reason to stop it before that. "A reason," Darius said. She looked at him. The silver eyes were different now from every version he had seen of them. The ancient weight was still there. It would always be there. It was part of what she was, but the quality of it had changed. The depth that had been like looking into something that had no bottom had developed a bottom, a real one. Not a limit, not a shallowing, but the specific quality of depth that has been acknowledged rather than denied. Grief that has been named and carried openly rather than sealed. A reason, she said again. Not answering, sitting with the word. He did not push. She looked back at the horizon. You need to know what the forgiveness is not, she said, because I think you have an idea of it that is easier than what it actually is, and you deserve the honest version. Tell me, he said. It is not an erasure of what happened, she said. The great hall, the garden, the words you said in front of 400 people. She said it directly, without cruelty but without softness, the way you say things that are true and that have stopped being weapons because you have decided they are going to be facts instead. Those things happened. They are part of what I know about you. They do not stop being part of what I know about you because of the past 4 days. She paused. Forgiveness is not amnesia. It is a decision about what to do with the accurate memory of a real thing. Darius sat with this. He had, he realized, been imagining forgiveness as a kind of restoration, a return to a state before the damage. A door reopened. He was sitting now with the understanding that the door that had existed before was gone, along with the capital and the core provinces and the founding structures of everything his family had built. What was possible was not restoration. What was possible was something that had to be built from the current ground, which was damaged and altered and nothing like the ground they had started on. I understand, he said. I don't think you do yet, she said, not unkindly. But I think you will. He accepted this without argument. The sun was lower now, the afternoon moving through itself with the ordinary insistence that time maintains regardless of what the people inside it are going through. In the northwest, the highland settlements were still there, 10,000 people alive in the improvised camp, Holt holding the position. The Keldrath advance halted on the ridge by the decision of one marshal who had trusted her own judgment over her orders. All of it contingent, temporary, requiring decisions that had not yet been made. All of it real. What do you need? Darius said. She turned to him at the question. The question had come out differently than he intended, or rather, it had come out exactly as intended, which was differently from how he had always asked the questions that concerned other people's needs. Not what do you require from a strategic standpoint, not what is the optimal arrangement from a logistical perspective. What do you need? Aimed directly at the person rather than at the problem surrounding her. She considered it time, she said. Not managed time, not time inside someone else's structure. Time to find out what I am when I'm not a vessel for something. She looked at her own hands, open in her lap. The hands that had tended his wounds and moved through gray herbs in a stone garden and pressed flat against the sealed place in her chest through the worst days of both their lives. I have been the carrier of this thing since I was old enough to understand what I was carrying. I do not know yet what I am without it. I know that, he said. I don't know what I am without the throne. She looked at him. That's not the same thing, she said. No, he said. But it's in the same territory. Something passed across her face, the cousin of amusement again, but closer to the real thing this time, less of the grief running underneath it, more of the actual feeling visible. It lasted only a second, but he had been watching her face long enough to know what a second of real feeling looked like on it, and to understand that the second was real. They sat until the sun was nearly at the ridgeline, and then Darius stood and she stood, and they walked to where the horse was ground-tied, and he held the reins and did not mount. The settlement needs managing, he said. The coalition needs a formal communication. Holt is handling both, and he is capable, but he should not be doing it without a clear line of authority. Then go, she said. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. She looked at him. I know. You'll still be here. It was not a question. It was not a demand. It was something in between. An observation with a small uncertainty in it, an acknowledgement that she was making her own choices and that his belief about what those choices would be was just a belief, not a certainty, and that was appropriate. I'll still be here, she said. He mounted. He looked down at her from the horse with the late light behind her, and the open territory of what remained of Ravarin stretching east and the changed sky overhead. And he looked at her the way you look at things you have come close to losing, completely, with the specific attention of someone who has learned through the experience of almost not having that looking is not passive. "Elyra," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "not for stopping it, for the decision being yours." She held his eyes, then she looked away, back east, and he rode northwest. The conversation with Marshal Voss took 2 hours. It happened at the Highland settlement's northern edge, with Holt beside Darius and 2 of Voss's senior officers beside her. And it had the quality of a conversation between people who have each received a significant piece of new information and are in the process of integrating it into positions that were constructed around different information. It was not easy. It was not clean. Voss was a professional, and her professionalism was real. But she was also accountable to a coalition command that had invested significant resources in an advance that had now been halted, and the communication of why it had been halted was going to require a level of candor that military structures do not naturally accommodate. She was candid anyway. She told him the coalition would not contest what remained of the outer provinces, that the advance was officially reclassified from a territorial acquisition to a humanitarian observation, which was a formulation that served everyone's need for a structure to inhabit while the actual situation was absorbed. She told him the missing scout's family would be notified and that the coalition would not obscure the cause. She told him that the arrangement around Ravarin's displaced population would be a negotiated one, not a command one, that the 10,000 people in the Highland settlement would have representation in the discussions about their future, which was not the standard procedure and was something she was authorizing on her own judgment and would account for to her superiors in her own terms. Darius received all of this. He did not thank her more than once. He understood that she was not being generous. She was being precise. She had assessed the situation and made the decisions that the assessment supported, and the decisions happened to be ones that served the people in the settlement, and those were 2 separate things that should not be collapsed into each other. After Voss left to manage the formalization of the halt through her command structure, Holt stood beside Darius in the gathering dark and said nothing for a long time. "Sarath," Darius said eventually. "Sent his formal resignation of commission this afternoon," Holt said. "In writing, proper form. He's still in the settlement. He's been working the supply lines for the past 3 hours." Darius considered this. "Let him work," he said. Holt looked at him. "He made a calculation that was wrong," Darius said. "He is now making a different calculation. The different calculation is useful. Let it be useful." He paused. "People are more than their worst calculation. I need to be able to believe that right now." Holt was quiet for a moment. "And you," the old general said, "what calculation are you making?" Darius looked at the Highland settlement, the torches going up as the dark came in, the organized movement of people establishing the rhythms of a camp that was going to be there for longer than one night, the particular resilience of people who have been through a catastrophe and are on the other side of it and are doing the next necessary thing because the next necessary thing is always available, always real, regardless of what has been lost. "I am not making a calculation," Darius said. Holt looked at him. "I am figuring out what comes next," Darius said, "without the framework I used to use for figuring things out." He looked at the torchlit camp. "It is uncomfortable. I expect it will remain uncomfortable for some time." "That's not a plan," Holt said. "No," Darius said, "it's not." What came next arrived in the form of small, accumulative, ordinary decisions, which is the form that most real things arrive in once the catastrophe is over and the dust of it settles into the ground, and the ground has to be stood on again. The Highland settlement became a permanent camp in the weeks following, then a founding settlement in the outer territory that had survived the dissolution, the easternmost provinces, the places that were furthest from the origin, that had been acquired most recently by Ravarin's expansion and were now their own thing, no longer Ravarin's anything but not yet named. The naming took longer. The coalition formalized its withdrawal from the advance and established the negotiated arrangement that Voss had outlined, a process that took weeks and involved the people of the settlement having actual representatives in the room where their future was being decided, which was, as Holt observed with the dry precision of a man who had been in too many rooms where people's futures were decided without them, an unusual administrative precedent and possibly a useful one. Sarath worked the supply lines for a month. Then the construction coordination. He was good at it. He had always been good at organizing complex systems, and the work did not resolve the question of what he was or what he had done, but it placed him in the position of someone who was useful in the specific situation that his own decisions had contributed to creating, which was its own kind of accounting. Elyra came to the settlement 3 weeks after the dissolution stopped. She came on foot, alone, having spent the intervening weeks doing what she had said she needed to do, finding out what she was when she was not a vessel. She had walked the territory that remained. She had seen the bare ground where the capital had been, the smooth geography of the inner provinces, the places where Ravarin had been and was not anymore. She had seen them with the eyes of the last moonbound heir, and also with the eyes of a 20-year-old woman who was learning what it meant to look at things without the weight of a sealed inheritance pressing behind her eyes. She found Darius in the settlement's eastern boundary, where he had been spending his mornings looking at the unnamed territory. She stopped beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The morning light was moving across the ground, ordinary light, the kind that belonged to any day, the kind that the land had been receiving every morning before any kingdom claimed it, and would continue receiving every morning after the last memory of that kingdom was gone. "How was it?" he said, "walking it?" "Strange," she said. "Honest." She looked at the ground. There were places where I could feel what had been there before your family's founding, the moonbound settlements, the original geography. She was quiet for a moment. It didn't feel like grief. It felt like recognition, like meeting something that had been absent long enough to become abstract and finding it more real than the abstract version. "Is that a good thing?" he said. She thought about it genuinely. "It is a true thing," she said. "Whether it's good or not isn't the question I'm asking yet. I'm still in the part where I find out what's true." He turned from the territory to look at her. She looked back. The silver eyes had settled into themselves in the weeks since the ridge. The luminosity was still there. She suspected it always would be, that it was part of what she was rather than a symptom of the active seal, but it was no longer the overwhelming, fully opened quality of those days. It was the steady, deep quality of someone who is carrying what they carry openly rather than sealed, who has made space inside themselves for the weight of it rather than compressing it into a lock. She was learning what she was. It was visible. "I have not decided about forgiveness yet," she said. "I know," he said. "I may not decide for a long time." "I know that too." "And you're going to be here," she said. Not asking, assessing, the same complete attention to his face that she had always brought. "Yes," he said. "Not because I'm waiting for an answer, because this is where I am, because the work here is real, and the people here are real, and I have things I owe this place that have nothing to do with what you decide." He held her eyes. "What I had before was a kingdom. What I have now is a debt to these people, to the territory that remains, to the process of figuring out how to build something that is not built on the same logic as what came before." He paused. "That's enough. That's sufficient to be doing." "Boss." She looked at him for a long time, then she said, "I'll stay." 2 words, carrying in them neither the full weight of resolution nor the performance of romantic restoration. Just a decision, genuinely made, to be in the same place as the unfinished work and the unfinished people and the unfinished question of what forgiveness is when it is honest rather than ceremonial. He nodded. She looked back at the territory. He looked at it beside her. This was what remained. Not the empire, not the fortress, not the 15 years of institutional power that had been built on the logic of fear, not even the specific happiness of people who have been through catastrophe together and emerged on the same side of it. That was not what remained, because happiness was not a permanent condition and was not the point. What remained was simpler and more durable than happiness. Ground. Real ground, under real feet, belonging to itself rather than to any claim placed on it. People organized around the next necessary thing rather than around the maintenance of a structure designed to perpetuate its own authority. A woman who had spent her life as a vessel and was finding out she was a person. A man who had spent his life as a mechanism for producing power and was finding out what he was made of underneath the power. The finding out was ongoing. It would remain ongoing. This was the thing that the kingdom had never taught him, and that the loss of the kingdom was teaching him now. That the finding out is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited. That the man who needs to have all his uncertainties resolved before he can stand somewhere and be present in it is a man who will never stand anywhere. That presence, real presence, without the structure that makes presence feel safe, is the only territory worth occupying. He had occupied a kingdom. He was learning on this eastern boundary of unnamed land, in the ordinary morning light, beside a woman who had not yet forgiven him and might not for a long time, what it meant to occupy something real. There were no armies now, no throne, no court, no generals, no tribute flowing in from 14 subjugated territories, no formal power of any kind, only the morning, only the ground, only the work that needed doing, and the person beside him who had decided, for today, to be in the same place. It was not enough for the man he had been. It was exactly enough for the man he was becoming. Elyra pressed her hand flat against her chest once more. Not the gesture of holding a seal, not the farewell motion she had made in the garden and the great hall. Something different. Something that belonged to the category of checking on something you are still learning to carry openly. Making sure it was there, making sure the carrying was real. It was. She let her hand drop. Beside her, Darius Thornheart, who had been a king, stood on unnamed ground in the ordinary light and breathed. That was all. That was everything. The land stretched east, unnamed and patient, remembering what it had always been, waiting for whatever would grow on it next without grief and without the logic of conquest, waiting with the specific, unhurried patience of ground that has existed long enough to know that what is built on it is always temporary, that what endures is always simpler than the structures placed above it. The morning moved through itself. The two people standing at its edge moved with it, not toward resolution, not toward the clean conclusion that stories offer when they want to spare you the truth of what comes after, toward the next hour, and the hour after that, and the long, ordinary, unglamorous work of becoming something other than what the worst of you had made, which is, in the end, the only story worth telling, the only one that is genuinely true.